They called him the Prince of Crows, not out of affection nor out of awe, but because the name whispered across Vox lines and enemy command channels inspired dread. Sevatar, Jago Sevatarion, first captain of the Night Lords, equerry to the Night Haunter, master of the Atramentar. To speak his name on the battlefield was to speak of precision, slaughter, and something far worse, certainty. Amongst the Legionese Astartes, Sevatar was something rare. Not just skilled, many space marines could claim that. Not just feared, any Astartes could be a terror to mortals. Sevatar was feared by other Astartes. Warriors bred for war regarded him with a caution usually reserved for greater monsters. He was the knife in the dark that left no survivors. He was the silent voice before the pain. He was, above all, a reminder that terror was a tactic best wielded by those who understood it absolutely. Even before the heresy, his reputation had rippled through the ranks of the other legions. His methods during compliance campaigns were fast, precise, and irredeemably brutal. He did not wage war with honor. Sevatar waged war with the promise of annihilation. He gave no ground to morality or code. He broke his enemies utterly, psychologically before physically, and physically before spiritually. It wasn't enough for his foes to die. They had to understand. They had no chance from the moment he arrived. When the Night Lords made planetfall, there was a grim anticipation among defending forces. Some hoped they might face Kurz himself, the demigod from Nostromo who spoke with the Emperor and walked like a wraith. But more often it was Sevatar they encountered. He didn't broadcast his presence like a Primarch. He radiated it. Wherever he walked, the walls seemed to shrink, the shadows deepened, and even hardened commanders found their fingers trembling on trigger mechanisms. He was a duelist without equal, a tactician bred for annihilation, and behind it all, a being utterly sure of his role in the universe. Not as a savior, not as a villain, but as a natural consequence of failure. To Sevatar, war was not theater. It was accounting. If you resisted the Imperium, you were already marked for extinction. His job was merely to make that truth arrive with a flourish. There are stories told of him that no one has confirmed, but that persist regardless. One tale speaks of a siege on the industrial moon of Tsotha 9. The planetary defense force refused to surrender, certain the fortress held long enough for Imperial fists to reinforce them. Sevatar came alone. He walked through their gate under a flag of parley and said nothing, merely showed them a data slate with names, every name of every commander, every family member, every hidden safe house they had. When he left, the garrison laid down their arms. Some slit their own throats before the Night Lords ever fired a shot. Another story speaks of a duel with a White Scars commander during the Scour of Gora. Both men fought for 12 minutes in a blur of ceramite and roaring chain blades before Sevatar whispered something the Vox recorders never captured. The White Scar dropped his weapon and knelt. Sevatar killed him anyway. When asked why, he responded, "Because war is not a game of forgiveness." There was no joy in him, no laughter behind the cruelty. Sevatar was not like some of the more theatrical monsters that would later stain the galaxy red in the name of chaos. He did not wear madness like a cloak. He was composed, cold, intelligent. If anything, that made him worse. Unlike some of his brothers in the Chiroptera, Sevatar never hid behind excuses. He did not lie to himself about being a necessary evil. He was evil, and he wore that truth as comfortably as his war plate. When the Great Crusade was still young and idealism still clung to the banners of the Emperor's legions, Sevatar had already cast that illusion aside. He viewed the galaxy through a singular lens, strength and weakness. Everything else was noise. Mercy was weakness. Honor was weakness. Hope was a cruel trick. Justice, though, justice was a blade, and he was its edge. The Atramentar, his Terminator elite, followed him not out of discipline, but reverence. Sevatar didn't ask for loyalty. He earned it by being the apex predator in a legion of killers. When he strode into war, they moved behind him like a wave of living darkness. No commands were shouted, no tactics broadcast. Sevatar fought like an artist who had already painted the battlefield before the enemy ever arrived. Other legions feared his title, Prince of Crows, as if it bore some ancient curse. But in truth, it was a name given to him by his enemies, perhaps even the people of Nostromo. It spoke of his silhouette among the ruins, a winged shape where no wings were, a creature perched on the battlefield, watching before it struck. Silent, swift, final. It was not only his prowess in war that made him infamous, it was his timing. Sevatar always appeared when things were at their bleakest. His arrival didn't signal reinforcements or hope. It meant the moment of reckoning had come. When the crows arrived, the feast had already been chosen, and he was always hungry. During the later stages of the Great Crusade, when the cracks between the legions widened and the Emperor's vision started to twist under its own weight, Sevatar's cynicism looked more like prophecy. He never believed in the dream of unity. He knew how easily peace could rot. He had seen it on Nostromo. He had lived it. In many ways, Sevatar didn't fall during the heresy. He had already fallen before it began. Even amongst traitors, he was respected and feared. Even amongst loyalists, he was remembered, not with hatred, but with dread admiration. Sigismund once said of him, "He does not duel. He disassembles. Every strike is a truth, cold, undeniable, and absolute." By the time the heresy began in full, Sevatar's legend had already been etched in void glass. Whole regiments abandoned postings if word came that the first captain had taken the field. His mere presence could end wars. Sevatar didn't ask to be remembered. He didn't care if history honored him. In his own words, he once told a captured general before execution, "I am not the nightmare, I am the consequence." And so, before the fires of betrayal consumed the Imperium, before the names of Horus and Kurz were spoken with venom and horror, one name was already feared, spoken like a curse, whispered like a warning. Sevatar, the Prince of Crows, a legend of dread. A shadow that even light fled from, and a warning that justice, when delivered without mercy, does not beg to be understood. It only demands to be remembered. Nostromo was a world of darkness, both literal and spiritual. A black orb locked in the shadow of its gas giant, it knew no daylight. Its sun, distant and anemic, cast no salvation upon its surface. The cities festered beneath that oppressive twilight, their towers built on suffering, their streets paved with the blood of the weak. It was here, amidst the rot of hopelessness, that Jago Sevatarion was born. The hives of Nostromo, particularly Nostromo Quintus, were not merely places of poverty or lawlessness. They were self-consuming beasts, cities that ate their young, ruled by crime syndicates and blood cults, policed by fear and ruled by cruelty. The very air smelled of rust, oil, and ash. The weak disappeared. The strong turned predatory. Mercy was viewed not as a virtue, but a mistake, one that would get you gutted in an alley and left for the scavenger rats to finish. In this grim crucible, Sevatar rose, not as a product of his environment, but as its perfection. His childhood is largely a mystery. No records survive from the Nostroman hive registries, burned, erased, or never written. What little is known comes from whispers, interrogations, and scraps of recollection long after his rise to prominence. But all accounts agree on one thing. From a very young age, Jago had already become feared. He didn't rule through brutality alone, as many child gang lords did in the Undercity. Sevatar ruled through precision. He was never loud, never boastful. He understood instinctively that terror was more effective when applied like a scalpel, not a hammer. His first kills were clean, his first victories total. He rose through the gang ranks not because he was the strongest, but because those around him believed he saw more than anyone else. Even then, something set him apart. Some said his eyes glowed faintly in the dark, catching the neon flicker of hive globes with unnatural clarity. Others claimed he could predict ambushes before they were sprung, sense betrayal before a blade left its sheath. One terrified gang lieutenant swore Sevatar once stood in the middle of a crossfire, untouched, as if he knew where every bullet would land. These weren't just urban legends. They were the first signs of his latent psychic ability, an untrained, untapped talent for foresight and spatial awareness. But on Nostromo, such gifts were more dangerous than useful. Psychers were feared and killed out of superstition, often hunted by mobs or sacrificed in dark rituals to blood-soaked idols. Sevatar learned to hide his ability, to turn it inward, to master it without ever speaking of it. There were moments, flickers, when he'd feel something crawl beneath his skin, a twinge before a fight, a whisper before a betrayal. He didn't understand it, but he learned to listen. When he acted on those feelings, he lived. When he ignored them, others died. That was lesson enough. His true turning point came not in a back-alley skirmish, but in the silence afterward. The corpse of a rival lay before him, throat slit ear to ear. Sevatar had done it with a broken bottle, not out of desperation, but to make a point. Around him, others watched, not in horror, but in a stunned kind of reverence. He had killed the untouchable. The gangs that had once demanded his loyalty now offered tribute. He didn't take it. Sevatar was never interested in being another gang lord atop a crumbling throne of addicts and beggars. He had already begun to see beyond Nostromo. Not in literal geography, he had no knowledge of the stars, but in perspective. He felt the world for what it was, a decaying system, a hive without a queen, a wound left to rot. He despised it. He despised them, the people who let this fester. So when the recruitment gunships of the 8th Legion descended, he didn't resist. He walked out of the underhive without hesitation, covered in drying blood, and stared into the spotlights without flinching. The Night Lords had come, as they did once every decade, to harvest from the worst Nostromo had to offer. They didn't take volunteers, they took survivors, killers, monsters. Jago Sevatarion walked up the boarding ramp alone, eyes forward, and never looked back. The 8th Legion recognized something in him almost immediately. Nostromo had no shortage of murderous candidates, but Sevatar was different. He listened, he learned. He didn't indulge in chaos or excess. His violence was deliberate. His mind was sharp. While other recruits postured and brawled in the training cages, Sevatar studied them like prey. Even the apothecaries and gene weavers noted his unusually rapid adaptation to the gene seed. While many of the Nostroman-born Astartes displayed erratic psychological profiles, Sevatar maintained emotional control, channeling his brutality with disturbing focus. He never laughed during torture drills. He never yelled during punishment sessions. He simply watched, and when it was his turn, he acted without hesitation. During his trials, he was paired against a larger Astartes initiate, one who had killed 2 instructors in a fit of rage. Most expected Sevatar to die. He didn't. The fight lasted 14 seconds. Sevatar struck only 3 times. Each strike was perfect. The last one severed the other's spine at the neck. After that, his instructors stopped referring to him by name. They began calling him Sevatarion, not as a title, but as a form of respect. The suffix had been used for senior officers in the past, rarely bestowed on a mere initiate. But Sevatar wasn't like the others. Conrad Kurz noticed him soon after. The Primarch, tormented and reclusive even then, was known for taking an obsessive interest in certain individuals, those he saw as reflections of himself. Sevatar was one such reflection. He understood the unspoken law of Kurz's Legion. Terror is a weapon, but only if it is used with surgical precision. Kurz tested him in ways no one else dared, assigned him to silent kills during live campaigns, dropped him on planets alone with no gear, and waited to see what returned. Every time Sevatar came back bloodied but victorious. There were never witnesses, just wreckage. But more than that, Sevatar displayed something Kurz never expected to find in his sons: loyalty without fear. He didn't tremble before the Primarch's presence. He didn't avert his eyes. He spoke plainly, even bluntly, when most dared not speak at all. And Kurz, in his fractured wisdom, respected that. The darkness of Nostromo had forged many Night Lords, but only one, Prince of Crows. Sevatarion emerged from the nightmare not as a broken child, but as its purest expression, a man who had never believed in the light, who never needed hope, and who could weaponize despair with surgical precision. He was not shaped by Nostromo's evil. He understood it. He agreed with it. And he knew, long before the heresy, that the Imperium's dream was built on lies. In that city of endless night, Jago Sevatarion learned the first law of his life. Justice is only real when it is enforced by fear. And so, as the warp-tainted future crept ever closer, the shadows that had birthed him stretched across the stars, carried on wings of midnight, heralded by the whisper of a name that would one day shake even the bravest hearts: Sevatar. Before the galaxy came undone, before Horus uttered words that would fracture brotherhood and shatter empires, Jago Sevatarion had already carved his legacy into the bones of 1,000 conquered worlds. He did not rise to power through ceremony or political maneuvering. His ascent was a matter of survival and inevitability. For a legion that revered strength, cunning, and unflinching execution, there was no one more suited than Sevatar to stand at the apex beside the Night Haunter himself. The Great Crusade was a tide that swept the stars clean of resistance, or so the Imperial archives would later claim. But those who stood in its path knew better. Every world brought into compliance came at a cost. And when diplomacy failed, when culture and pride refused to bow, that was when the Night Lords were unleashed. They were not negotiators, they were the Emperor's scalpel of terror. And Sevatar was their edge. It began with a campaign on the edge of the Ghoul Stars, an unnamed cluster of systems where human societies had drifted into violent theocracies. The Night Lords were sent not to parley, but to extinguish. Sevatar was still a line officer then, commanding a company-sized force with a reputation for brutal efficiency. When the 53rd Compliance met resistance from a techno-cult ruling the moon of Carapan, Sevatar didn't request orbital bombardment. He requested silence. He and 80 Night Lords descended in total blackout. Vox silence. No landing beacons. No warning. They infiltrated hive domes in the dead hours of the local night, disabling life support in the lower habs, executing defense commanders in their sleep, and rewriting the cult's network systems to broadcast only one message: the dark is not empty. By the time Imperial remembrancers arrived to document the compliance, the cultists had already surrendered to an enemy they never saw. Some had taken their own lives, convinced the Emperor had sent ghosts rather than men. The 53rd was renamed after that, the Silent Company. And its commander was elevated to a new position, captain of the Atramentar. The Atramentar were no mere honor guard. They were the elite Terminator cadre of the 8th Legion. veterans of uncounted war zones, selected not for loyalty but for results. Each one was a war criminal by Imperial standards, each one a monster by human measure. Sevatar became their commander not because he demanded it, but because there was no one else they would follow. Conrad Curzay himself made the appointment in one of the few public declarations the reclusive Primarch ever issued. It was done aboard the Bridge of the Nightfall, the Legion's flagship. Curzay spoke only a single sentence as he placed a gauntleted hand on Sevatar's pauldron. He understands the silence between screams. The Legion understood the meaning. Sevatar was more than just a killer. He listened to the language of terror. He knew how long to wait before the strike, how much blood to spill to make a message permanent, and how to restrain the blade just long enough to make the victim's mind fracture before the body did. As first captain, Sevatar was more than a commander. He became the executioner of vision. The Chiroptera, the Night Lord's War Council, debated targets and philosophies. Kurz whispered prophecy in riddles, but Sevatar made the plans real. He interpreted Kurz's madness with frightening clarity, translating fractured dreams into military action. This role brought him into conflict with others. The Chiroptera was filled with ambitious captains, Nostraman warlords who fancied themselves inheritors of Kurz's legacy. Sevatar crushed them, not through violence, though he was more than capable, but through sheer competence. He understood logistics better than the quartermasters. He dissected enemy strategy with greater precision than the tacticians. And when a target was assigned, he achieved results that no other captain could match. On the irradiated hives of Duram, it took the Night Lords 3 weeks to bring down the planetary defense grid. Sevatar did it in 3 days. On Till's Reach, where 3 legions had failed to pacify the orbital slums, Sevatar simply sealed the atmospheric processors and broadcast the slow suffocation of the population on every frequency. When the last bastion surrendered, he accepted their terms with a single condition: that they burn their own archives and erase their own history. "You will not be remembered," he told them. "That is your punishment." Sevatar didn't need to shout. He didn't deliver sermons like Lorgar or bellow challenges like Angron. His authority was quiet, firm, and utterly unshakable. His men followed because defiance meant death. But more than that, they followed because, beneath the brutality, Sevatar never lied to them. He didn't pretend to be a hero. He didn't sell glory or nobility. He offered only truth. We are monsters, and monsters survive. His bond with the Atramentar was unbreakable. These were not merely his subordinates. They were extensions of his will. Some said Sevatar trained with them in total silence, issuing no orders, moving only through gesture and glance. In the field, they operated like a single organism. One of the few surviving logs from a Raven Guard warband described an encounter aboard a void station. There were 6 of them. Heavy armor. No sound, no warning. They came through the floor plating. The first 2 took the sentries. The third shut down the reactor. The rest moved through us like smoke. I fired 3 times. I'm not sure if they noticed. This efficiency earned Sevatar the fear of other legions. Among the Luna Wolves, stories of Sevatar's shadow operations were used to frighten new initiates. Among the Ultramarines, his name became synonymous with surgical terror. Even the word-bearers, so fond of ritual and spectacle, spoke of him with caution. Erebus once described him as a man who kills meaning itself. And then there was his relationship with Kurz. To say it was complicated would be an insult to its depth. Sevatar was the only one who could look Kurz in the eyes and not flinch. Not because he was brave, but because he saw something in his gene father that others refused to acknowledge. A broken man trying to shape a broken galaxy with shattered tools. Sevatar never worshipped Kurz. He respected him, pitied him even, but never deified him. In private moments, when the Night Haunter raged at visions only he could see, it was Sevatar who remained silent and still, not offering comfort, just presence, a grim sentinel bearing witness. It said Curze once asked him, "Do you believe I'm mad?" To which Sevatar replied, "I believe you're right, that's worse." No one else could speak to the Primarch that way and live, the Legion noticed, and so while others whispered of succession and prophecy, Sevatar stood at the center of the storm, unchallenged, unshaken, and unafraid. He was the Night Lord's knife in the dark, their truth made flesh, the first captain. And when the galaxy began to fall apart, it was Sevatar who stood ready, not as a herald of rebellion, but as a man who had always known that the dream would die screaming. He didn't grieve for the Imperium. He had never believed in it. But when the moment came to choose, Sevatar would not hesitate, because while others questioned fate and loyalty, he already understood the only law that mattered. Survival is not given. It is taken, with blood, with silence, with precision. And he was the master of all three. The Night Haunter did not dream like mortal men. His visions were not idle glimpses of hope or fragments of subconscious memory. They were nightmares shaped into prophecy, screaming truths torn from the howling depths of his mind and laid bare before the future arrived. And Jago Sevatarion, first captain of the Night Lords, stood closer to that storm than any other living soul. Sevatar did not believe in fate. He believed in preparation, in the deliberate weight of a strike, in the precise management of fear. To him, prophecy was a tool wielded by zealots and fools, but Conrad Kurz was neither. He was something far worse, a prophet whose visions always came true. It was in those rare, jagged silences between wars that Sevatar first learned the extent of his Primarch's burden. He remembered the cold of the strategium chamber aboard the Nightfall, lit only by flickering hololiths and the pale reflections of distant stars. Kurz would sit, unmoving, whispering fragments of future atrocities in a voice too quiet for augurs to register. Sevatar would stand by the edge of the chamber, silent and watching, never interrupting, never offering comfort. He knew better than to speak when the visions gripped his gene father. But there were times, rare as they were, when Kurz invited his first captain into that darkness. One such moment came during the campaign on the Garax cluster. The Night Lords had broken the orbital defense platforms within hours, scattered the planetary PDF like leaves before a gale. The enemy's leaders were hunted down and publicly executed, their flayed skin used to drape the towers of their capital hive. It was a textbook display of calculated terror, a message that no further resistance would be tolerated. Sevatar stood at the edge of the massacre, arms crossed, watching his Atramentar oversee the final stages. And then, without warning, Kurz spoke into his mind. No Vox channel, no astropathic link, just presence. "You do this so well," the Night Haunter whispered from a distance of 100 kilometers. "And yet you do not know why." Sevatar found his Primarch alone in the cathedral ruins, standing among cracked stone saints with blank faces. The building had once honored the Emperor. Now it honored nothing. Kurz didn't look at him. He stared upward through shattered glass into the cold stars. "Do you know how you die?" the Primarch asked, as though continuing a conversation they'd never begun. Sevatar hesitated only a moment before replying, "No." Kurze turned then, and in the warped reflection of his eyes, Sevatar saw fire, dying ships, dead suns, his own face bloodied and chained. "I do." There was no boasting in the Primarch's voice, no challenge, just the hollow tone of a man who had seen his own funeral so many times that it no longer moved him. "You see visions," Sevatar said, "but I see patterns. One is art, The other is architecture. Kurz smiled, a terrifying thing, his gaunt features twisted in a rictus that was not joy but understanding. "Would you like to know your death, Sevatarion?" The first captain did not answer. Kurz continued, his voice now a whisper. "You die in chains, betrayed, alone, but not forgotten." Silence stretched between them. No breath, no wind, just the cold weight of prophecy. "You see the end," Sevatar finally said, "but do you ever see why?" And Kurz, after a pause, gave the most chilling answer of all. "No." That single syllable haunted Sevatar more than any corpse or massacre ever had. He returned to his duties with a new weight, a sensation he despised: uncertainty. He had never needed prophecy to know what was coming. He could read the signs in the stars, in the way other legions moved, in the glances exchanged between brothers during war councils. But to have it confirmed by the Night Haunter, that was something else entirely. It was not just Kurz's visions that gnawed at Sevatar, it was his own dreams. Long before he admitted it, the first captain's psychic abilities had begun to uncoil within him. Suppressed for decades, they stirred now like serpents beneath the surface. He would see flashes, blood on unfamiliar hands, stars shattering, the corpse of Nostromo split open like a rotten fruit. He would feel thoughts not his own brushing the edge of his mind, and most disturbingly, he would sometimes know what a man would say before he said it. He never spoke of it. Not to his brothers, not to the Atramentar, not even to Kurz. To admit psychic mutation was to invite judgment, or worse, recruitment by the Librarius, not something the Night Lords respected. They saw psychers as either weapons or weaknesses. Sevatar chose to be neither. And yet, during a campaign against the Mar Confederacy, his restraint faltered. A planetary governor, a man who had orchestrated the bombing of several Night Lords' outposts, was captured alive. The Atramentar wanted him publicly dismembered. Sevatar agreed. But just before the sentence was carried out, he touched the prisoner's forehead, only for a second. In that moment, a flood of memories rushed into his mind. A child watching his mother executed, a man rising through ranks built on betrayal, a secret hope that he might negotiate his survival even in the face of death. Sevatar recoiled, disgusted, not with the prisoner, but with himself. His powers were growing, and with them the boundaries he had set were eroding. He returned to his chambers and destroyed 3 training servitors in unprovoked fury. That night he slept for only an hour. When he woke, he found a message waiting for him, written in Kurz's own hand. "You cannot run from what you are. You can only direct where it leads." The nightmares intensified after that, not from the warp, not from demons, but from within. Sevatar would relive battles he had never fought, smell blood he had never spilled, hear screams in languages no longer spoken, and through it all the whispers of destiny. He hated it, hated the implication that his actions were not his own, hated the idea that Kurz's madness might be a truth rather than a sickness, hated most of all the possibility that he too might become what the Primarch had become, a slave to the future. But the more he resisted, the more fate closed in. During a void battle against the Pale Sun's mercenary fleet, Sevatar personally boarded their flagship. It was supposed to be a swift execution, a show of dominance. Instead, the enemy commander surrendered before a single shot was fired. He dropped to his knees, weeping, and begged forgiveness. "I saw you," the man sobbed. "In my dreams, you were the end." Sevatar killed him without a word, but the word stayed with him. The first captain of the Night Lords was no longer just a weapon. He had become an omen, a harbinger, and that terrified him in a way no enemy blade ever had. He tried in private moments to rationalize it, to bury himself in tactics and kill ratios, to focus on the now. But the shadow of what would come could not be ignored, because Konrad Kurz had never lied. Not once. not ever. And if the Night Haunter had truly seen Sevatar's death, betrayed, alone, and chained, then that meant the most precise killer in the galaxy was now fighting a war he had already lost. But still, he fought, because prophecy may predict the end, but Sevatar had always believed in controlling the middle. Some wars are fought with weapons, others with messages, but the most dangerous wars, the ones that shape legends, are fought with pride. The planet Sherrod was nothing special in the grand designs of the Great Crusade. A temperate agri-world with marginal strategic value, its integration into the Imperium should have been swift and uneventful. But the planet's ruling caste refused compliance. They did not spit venom at the Imperium's emissaries or raise the banners of defiance with grand oratory. No, Sherrod resisted with silence, with measured words, with firm denials wrapped in ceremony and veiled threats. A bureaucrat's war, the kind the Night Lords loathed. Sevatar, already first captain of the Atramentar, arrived in orbit aboard the Nightfall, his mood as cold as the void beyond the bridge. He had no patience for arrogance masquerading as diplomacy. The longer a compliance dragged, the more bodies were wasted beneath it. Sherrod would learn. It was only a question of how. But Sherrod was not alone. The Imperial Fists had been dispatched to oversee the system's fortification and offered to assist in the compliance efforts. This was a diplomatic decision made far from the battlefield, an attempt by the Lord Commander of Segmentum Solar to encourage unity among the legions. On parchment, it was an excellent plan. The Night Lords would drive terror into the hearts of the defiant, while the Imperial Fists would offer the hand of righteous rebuilding afterward. In practice, it was a recipe for disaster. Sevatar met the Fists' delegation with his usual blend of cutting restraint and open contempt. He considered their sense of honor a handicap, their loyalty to codes and traditions a disease that clouded efficiency. But more than that, Sevatar despised their certainty. In a galaxy where only brutality survived, the idea that wars could be just was a myth he refused to entertain. Leading the Fist's force was Sigismund, the first captain of the 7th Legion. A warrior of immense discipline and control, Sigismund was as different from Sevatar as day was from night. And yet, beneath their opposing philosophies lay something unspoken: mutual recognition. Each was the blade of their legion. Each had earned their title in blood. Each had been chosen, not by politics, but by purpose. Their first meeting was civil, almost sterile. Sigismund offered a formal nod, spoke of duty and mutual interests, and proposed an equal division of responsibilities during the campaign. Sevatar responded with a crooked smile and a single sentence: "If your warriors get in my way, they'll die first." From that moment, the fuse was lit. The conflict began not with words, but with methods. When Sherrod's ruling council refused the first summons, Sevatar deployed terror teams to their outer provinces. Within days, the grain silos of 30 farming collectives were burned. Vox recordings of the screams from the firebombed villages were spliced into the citywide announcement system. The message was clear. Resistance was no longer a choice. Sigismund was furious. He confronted Sevatar in a command chamber deep within their shared forward base. The conversation was quiet, but every word was edged. "You shame the Emperor's name," Sigismund said, jaw clenched. "This was not justice. This was slaughter." Sevatar didn't rise from his seat. He merely tilted his head. "Slaughter is justice," he replied. "Just ask the dead." The argument grew heated. The two captains stood eye to eye, ancient armor humming with restrained violence. Their aides tensed, hands on hilts, but the commanders ignored them. Finally, Sigismund removed his gauntlet and threw it at Sevatar's feet. "Let us see whose convictions are truer." The duel was set. It would be fought on neutral ground, an open plaza on Sharaut's surface, watched by representatives from both legions. The terms were strict: no ranged weapons, no interference. A duel of honor, blade against blade. Sigismund chose a power sword, its golden edge humming with restrained energy. Sevatar selected Knight's Whisper, his chain glaive, the teeth of the blade stained from 100 prior executions. The plaza was silent as they faced one another. No speeches, no announcements, only two champions staring into each other's future. Then, the clash. Sigismund came on like a thunderbolt, each strike a masterclass in precision and weight. Sevatar moved with fluid grace, parrying not with brute strength, but with angles, deflections, minimal movement. The duel was not quick. It stretched, minutes becoming hours. Their armor cracked, blood spilled, but neither fell. The onlookers watched in a mixture of awe and horror. It became clear this was no mere contest. It was a war of philosophies. Sigismund fought with purpose, with devotion to order and law. Sevatar fought with instinct and inevitability, each counterstrike a lesson in calculated savagery. They were evenly matched in skill, but not in outlook. At the 8-hour mark, Sevatar landed a glancing blow that tore Sigismund's pauldron away. At the 12th, Sigismund reversed a feint that nearly severed Sevatar's helm cabling. The crowd shifted from support to prayer. Even Astartes, those sons of gods, could not endure such a battle forever. At the 27th hour, Sigismund staggered, not from injury but from exhaustion. The heat of his armor, the weight of his doctrine, the burden of unrelenting discipline, each had taken their toll. Sevatar saw it. A flicker in the footwork, a momentary tremble in his opponent's breathing. And then Sevatar cheated. In a move that would be debated for centuries, Sevatar broke the rules of the duel. He headbutted Sigismund, armor against armor, skull against skull. The force of the blow shattered part of Sigismund's nose and knocked him off balance. He fell to one knee. Sevatar did not strike the killing blow. He simply stepped back and raised Knight's Whisper high. "It's done," he said. "You lose." Sigismund stared up at him, blood running down his chin. "You forfeited the moment you broke the code." Sevatar laughed, not mockingly, but coldly. "There is no code. There is only who stands and who kneels." He offered no hand, no apology, just walked away, his gauntlet still soaked in sweat and honorless triumph. That night, the Night Lords completed the compliance of Sharaut in silence. The ruling caste surrendered without further resistance. The cities remained standing, the infrastructure intact, but the morale of the defenders was shattered. Word of the duel spread among the civilian population, mutating as it passed from mouth to mouth. In one version, Sevatar had killed the Imperial Fist and skinned him alive. In another, he had shown mercy and spared a worthy foe. But in every version, Sevatar's name was the one whispered with fear. Sigismund, for his part, recovered and returned to duty. He never spoke of the duel again, but those close to him noticed a shift afterward, a coldness in his devotion, a steel edge to his faith. Some say the duel with Sevatar taught him the cost of mercy. Others say it taught him that the darkness could not be debated. It could only be destroyed. As for Sevatar, he never referred to the event again. Not as a victory, not as a failure. To him it was simply a reminder that in war there is no such thing as an even field, that only those willing to bend the rules survive them. And so on the plains of a forgotten world, two legends clashed, not just with weapons but with ideology. One walked away bloodied but unbroken, the other betrayed by his own sense of fairness. And in the silent aftermath, the galaxy tilted 1 degree further toward the abyss. Nostromo died in silence. No noble last stand, no final broadcast, no heroic self-sacrifice. It ended the way it had always lived, in darkness, choking on its own filth and fear. And the one who watched it burn without blinking was not Konrad Curze, not the emperor who had once claimed it for his own vision, but Jago Sevatarion, first captain of the Night Lords and Nostramo's truest son. To understand why a world was destroyed, one must understand what it became. Nostramo had never truly changed, even after the Night Haunter returned as its demigod ruler, even after the 8th Legion began to harvest recruits from its populace. The world never truly shed its rot. Its criminal underworld never vanished. It simply dressed itself in finer clothes. Its people never abandoned their cruelty. They merely redirected it into politics, into commerce, into the very institutions Curze once tried to reform. At first, it was subtle. A new caste of opportunists emerged, those who profited from the Legion's needs, who manipulated their proximity to terror into influence. Entire sectors of the planet's surface became supplier states, their hives restructured to feed the war machine. For a time, Sevatar and others believed it was progress. The Legion needed weapons, armor, flesh, and Nostramo could deliver. But what festered beneath that industry was familiar. Too familiar. Curze saw it first, or perhaps he always knew. The visions that tormented him had shown Nostramo's doom 1,000 times before it came, but it was Sevatar who witnessed the truth of it, not through prophecy, but through experience. On a return to Nostramo for rearming and recruitment, Sevatar walked the same streets he had once ruled in silence, but they no longer recognized him. The city was louder now, wealthier, yes, but gaudy and festering. The gangs had returned, not with blades and tattoos, but with silk collars and administrative titles. Power had changed its mask, but not its nature. One scene marked him forever. A boy, no older than Sevatar had been when the 8th Legion found him, was dragged from an alley by 3 armed enforcers. Not because he had killed or stolen, but because he had spoken against the planetary governor. Sevatar, watching from a tower above, saw himself in that child's eyes. He didn't intervene, not because he couldn't, but because he needed to watch. The boy didn't scream. He stared at his captors with the same silent loathing Sevatar remembered feeling for his own, and then they broke his legs. Sevatar turned away. The next day he stood before Curze and said 5 words. "It's worse than it was." Curze, pale and hollow-eyed, nodded, and then he gave the order. Nostramo was to die. Not punished, not reformed, not scoured or sterilized, destroyed, entirely, utterly. Sevatar did not question the command. Others did. Captain Shang, a respected commander among the Chiroptera and one of the few who still believed Nostramo could be salvaged, begged for reconsideration. He pleaded that the loyal deserved time to evacuate, that some on the world still served the Legion with honor. Sevatar heard him out, and then he told him, in a voice devoid of warmth, that honor is a currency for the dead. The bombardment plan was precise. Sevatar ensured it personally. He had no taste for spectacle, no desire to indulge in the excesses of sadists like Krukesh or Talos. Nostramo would not be made into a theater. It would be an execution. Fleet elements were positioned in high orbit, cyclonic torpedoes armed, Vox channels sealed, no warnings transmitted, no final demands, no pleas for surrender. Only a single transmission was ever sent to the surface. It contained one word: judgment. When the torpedoes struck, the crust of Nostramo cracked like brittle glass. Magma surged into the hive cities. Atmospheric fires ignited across half the hemisphere. Billions died before they could even scream. The rest burned before they could beg. From the observation deck of the Nightfall, Sevatar watched the planet collapse inward, its tectonic plates fracturing under their own pressure, its core beginning to destabilize. Captain Shang stood beside him, silent, trembling. Sevatar said nothing, until finally Shang whispered, "He's mad." Sevatar turned. His voice was like iron dragged across stone. "Number, you just hoped he wasn't?" And then he drew his blade. The duel was brief. Shang struck first, desperation behind every blow. But Sevatar had fought too many enemies, read too many movements. He parried once, twice, then drove Knight's Whisper through Shang's chest. He held the dying man's gaze as the fires of their homeworld burned across the sky behind them. "You wept for ghosts," Sevatar said. "I only see ash." Some records suggest there were riots among the crew following the destruction, that hundreds of mortal personnel rebelled, unable to stomach what they had helped destroy. Sevatar handled it with the same cold efficiency he had always employed. He didn't suppress the mutiny. He eradicated it. Atramentar squads moved through the decks in silence. No warning shots, no stun protocols. By the end of the day, the corridors were washed clean with bleach, and the names of the dead were struck from the ship's registers. None spoke of it again. In the days that followed, Kurz retreated further into isolation. Some whispered he had wept for the world he destroyed. Others claimed he had laughed. Only Sevatar knew the truth, that Kurz had felt nothing. Because Nostromo had already been dead long before the torpedoes fell. The planet had failed its Primarch. It had proven that nothing could be salvaged, that no amount of fear or structure could change human nature. In killing Nostromo, the Night Lords did not betray their origin. They fulfilled it. Sevatar never returned to that system again. He never spoke of the event. He didn't add a tally to his armor, nor carve a record of the bombardment onto his gauntlets, like some legionaries did with past victories. He didn't need to. Nostromo lived within him still, in every scar, in every contemptuous glance at the loyalists who still clung to ideals, in every cold execution he ordered. The destruction of his homeworld did not change Sevatar. It merely proved him right. And as the war to come began to whisper through the edges of the Imperium, rumors of rebellion, whispers of brother turning against brother, Jago Sevatarion stood unshaken. Because he had already lived through the death of his past, and he knew with brutal certainty that the future would burn just as easily. The galaxy bled in silence before the screams began. The death of Nostromo was not a singular event, it was a prelude, one of many quiet ruptures forming in the crust of an Imperium that pretended to be whole. Across the stars, legions murmured, Primarchs brooded, Horus Lupercal stirred, and somewhere in the deep black of the void, Sevatar sharpened his weapon, not just for the blood to come, but for the decision he had already made. He didn't worship Horus. He didn't believe in gods. Sevatarion believed in consequences, and by the time the galaxy noticed its own rot, he had already aligned himself with the inevitable. The order came quietly. Summon the captains. Make best speed to the Fidelitas Lex. The ship belonged to the word-bearers, their name already spoken in a hushed tone among the more pragmatic elements of the traitor legions. This was not a battlefield. It was not a war council. It was a reckoning of loyalty. Sevatar arrived with a few Atramentar, not out of paranoia, but practicality. He stepped aboard the Fidelitas Lex like a man walking into a barbed cage, not hesitating, not smiling, but ready. He had no illusions about what this meeting was. It was not about politics. It was about choosing sides before the knives came out. The ship stank of incense and blood. Every corridor bled faith. The walls were adorned with scratched-in scripture, not the sterile dogma of the ecclesiarchy, but something deeper, older, the kind of belief that crackled behind the eyes. Sevatar hated it immediately. They were led to the chamber, vaulted, red-lit, filled with banners and smoke. The gathering was already underway. Word-bearers, Iron Warriors, Alpha Legion, Night Lords. No titles, no formalities, no greetings. Just a room full of killers pretending to speak. Sevatar watched it unfold. Lorgar stood in the center, his eyes aflame with the zeal of someone who knew he had touched the divine and could not wait to burn the rest of the galaxy for its ignorance. His voice dripped with conviction as he spoke of the Emperor's lies, of how they were not sons but tools, not warriors but weapons. He spoke of destiny, of truth, of gods waiting in the void. Sevatar barely listened. He already knew the Emperor had lied. He didn't need warp-spawned visions or demon-whispered secrets to recognize hypocrisy. He had seen it, felt it in the way the Imperium used the legions like scalpels and shields, demanding sacrifice without question, loyalty without comprehension. Kurz had tried to show them, but no one had listened, so now the sons of the Imperium would scream instead. When Lorgar finished, there was a pause, the kind that hangs in the air like ozone before a lightning strike. And then, before anyone else moved, Sevatar stepped forward. He did not raise his voice. He did not deliver a sermon. He simply drew his chain blade, held it aloft, and said, "Death to the false emperor." The words hung in the chamber, raw and absolute, not a war cry, a verdict. Others joined in. Slowly at first, then like an avalanche, Iron Warriors banged fists to chests. Word-bearers wept openly. Alpha Legion agents, ever the observers, nodded in shadowed approval. But it was Sevatar who said it first. It wasn't the first treason. It wasn't the first betrayal. But it was the first declaration. From that moment on, Jago Sevatarion wasn't just a weapon of fear. He became a symbol, a shadow-crowned icon of open defiance. Where others couched their intentions in philosophical lamentations or desperate rationalizations, Sevatar offered only truth. "We were monsters before," he later told a word-bearer captain. "Now we just have better targets." He didn't fight for chaos. He didn't kneel before the dark gods. Sevatar didn't need the warp's validation. He needed no blessing. His allegiance to the War Master was forged not in belief, but in clarity. The Imperium was already broken. Horus had merely drawn the blade. The hours that followed were a blur of oaths and rituals. The word-bearers offered icons, chants, pacts. Some of the gathered knelt. Some cut themselves. Others screamed in ecstasy as the warp brushed their thoughts. Sevatar stood motionless. One of Lorgar's acolytes approached him, blood running from his eyes, carrying a small brazier of sacred ash. He offered Sevatar a brand. "Mark yourself in the name of truth." Sevatar looked down at the brand. Then he looked at the acolyte. And then, with all the force of his Terminator gauntlet, he crushed the man's skull. Blood sprayed across the stones. "Don't mistake my enemy for your god," he said. No one challenged him. Even among traitors, Sevatar was an anomaly. He was not driven by belief. He was driven by inevitability. He left the gathering before it concluded, stepping back onto the nightfall with purpose. His officers awaited him. He looked each in the eye, and they asked nothing. He gave them only an order. "Prepare for war." But even as the engines roared to life and the fleet began its slow burn toward Istvan, Sevatar felt the weight of what had begun. This was not rebellion. Not yet. This was the drawing of lines in a galaxy that had run out of room to pretend. His thoughts turned, as they often did, to Kurz. The Night Haunter had not attended the gathering. He did not need to. He had seen it already. Sevatar knew his Primarch would approve, if only for the blood that would follow. Kurz didn't care for sides. He cared only for punishment, and the galaxy had earned it. As the stars stretched before him, Sevatar stood at the viewing deck alone. His reflection stared back at him, silent, hollow-eyed, half-shadow. The Night Lords had never been loyal. Not truly. They had complied because compliance was survival. Now there was no more pretending. They would burn worlds not as enforcers, but as executioners. They would strike from the dark, not as soldiers of the Imperium, but as monsters unleashed. And Sevatar would lead them, not as a captain, but as the first to say aloud what they all already knew. That the Emperor had lied, that the dream was dead, that fear was the only law left worth enforcing, and the sentence was war. War is rarely honest. It hides behind banners and declarations, behind strategies and logistics and carefully worded lies. But on the blackened soil of Istvan V, all pretense died. The drop site massacre was not a battle. It was a betrayal sharpened to a monomolecular edge. And Jago Sevatarion, Prince of Crows, walked into that treachery with his blade already drawn and his conscience unburdened. It was not his plan. Horus, Lorgar, and Fulgrim had conceived the trap. Perturabo would spring it. Kurz had seen it in his mind long before the War Master ever uttered a word. And Sevatar, with no need for prophecy, understood its necessity the moment it was spoken aloud. The Loyalists would be summoned under false banners, Raven Guard, Salamanders, Iron Hands. They would land expecting brotherhood, and then they would die. Sevatar didn't revel in the deception. He didn't romanticize it. To him, the massacre was mathematics. 3 legions removed in one strike. The throne weakened, the galaxy thrown into shock. It wasn't betrayal, it was efficiency. He stood aboard the Nightfall as the fleet descended toward Istvan's tortured crust, watching as the planet's toxic skies flickered with fire. Below, the first wave had already deployed. The Loyalist legions were dug into the Urgal Depression, fortifying positions, rearming, preparing for the next assault. They didn't know the next wave would be their executioners. Sevatar donned his warplate in silence. The Atramentar assembled without command. Each Terminator was already aware. Each had sharpened their blades the night before. There were no war chants, no oaths, no ceremony. Only the methodical, practiced preparation of killers who knew exactly what they were about to do. As the gunships dropped, Sevatar gave a single order. No survivors, no warnings. They hit the ground like meteors. The Night Lords did not arrive with thunderous roars or vox-blared challenges. They struck from shadows, even in open daylight, using smoke and terrain to their advantage. The Raven Guard were the first to notice them, expecting support, only to be cut down mid-greeting. Sevatar moved through the trenches like a ghost of vengeance. His chain glaive, Night's Whisper, hummed with each cleave, tearing through ceramite and bone with equal ease. He didn't speak. He didn't shout orders. His men followed his wake, wordlessly erasing entire platoons in his shadow. It was not a battle. It was a butchery. He passed a squad of Iron Hands, their servo arms raised in desperate defense, their bionics sparking under last fire. Sevatar didn't slow. He moved through them with surgical cruelty, removing limbs, bisecting torsos, ensuring each wound was memorable. He understood terror wasn't just about killing, it was about how you killed. When he reached the heart of the Loyalist command, he found a Salamander's captain rallying a retreat. The man turned, sword already raised, eyes full of fury. "You dishonor the Gene Fathers," the Salamander roared. Sevatar tilted his head, curious. "And you thought loyalty meant mercy?" They fought briefly, 2 masters of violence locked in brutal rhythm. But Sevatar was faster, smarter, colder. The Salamander died on his knees, spine shattered, helmet cracked. Sevatar didn't offer words of triumph. He simply turned to the Vox unit the captain had tried to activate and crushed it underfoot. The air was thick with smoke and screaming. Vox networks fractured into static and blood. The Loyalists realized too late that the enemy wasn't just outside their trenches, it was among them. Sevatar moved like a storm of inevitability. But even amidst the chaos, something twisted clawed at the edge of the battlefield. He felt it before he saw it. The word-bearers had released the Gal Vorbak, the first of the possessed. Astartes no longer fully human, their forms bloated with demonic mutation, their weapons warping in their hands. Sevatar watched one of them tear through a Raven Guard squad with limbs that split and reknit between strikes. It repulsed him. He didn't fear it, he despised it. Not because it was alien, but because it was undisciplined. The warp was a tool, perhaps, but one that cut its wielder more often than its target. Sevatar believed in calculated terror, not in giving yourself to madness. He turned away, leaving the possessed to their frothing rampage. Later, Argel Tal of the Word-Bearers approached him, his armor stained with gore and scripture, eyes burning with something unclean. "The gods are watching," Argel Tal said, voice distant. Sevatar wiped blood from his gauntlet and looked him up and down. "They must be very proud," he replied, and then spat at Argel Tal's feet. They stared at each other for a long moment, and then Sevatar walked away. He didn't need to debate. He didn't need to understand. What the word-bearers had become was a path he would never tread. The loyalist lines crumbled by nightfall. Vulcan was gone. Ferrus Manus was dead, decapitated by Fulgrim in an act that reverberated like a thunderclap across the warp. Korax had fled, wounded and betrayed, his legion shattered. Sevatar didn't pursue. That wasn't his task. He regrouped with the Atramentar, who had lost only 2 of their number, both slain while laughing. They stood among the ruins, silent as always, blood steaming off their armor. The rest of the traitor forces celebrated. There were feasts, toasts, rituals. The word-bearers anointed themselves with the ashes of the dead. The Iron Warriors tallied fortification failures. The Emperor's children blared music into the sky. Sevatar stood apart. He watched the fires, not with satisfaction, but with certainty. This wasn't a victory, it was an inevitability. And more importantly, it was a beginning. The massacre had been necessary, but it had also been loud. Too loud. The Imperium would now know, would rally, would not forgive. The galaxy had been broken open with a single surgical strike, but the patient was not dead. Not yet. Later, aboard the Nightfall, Sevatar stood in the chapel vault, a place no priest had ever sanctified. There were no icons, just silence and starlight. Kurz was absent, as always, wandering the deeper decks, muttering to himself. Sevatar didn't need him tonight. He spoke to no one, only the void. This wasn't treason, he murmured. It was recognition. He thought of Sigismund, of Shang, of Nostramo, of the gods Argel Tal praised, of the Emperor who had raised them from filth only to cast them in shadow. He thought of what was still to come, and he smiled, just slightly, because the war had begun, and the galaxy would learn what the Night Lords had always known, that loyalty was a lie, that fear was truth, and that Jago Sevatarion was not a hero, not a villain, but an answer. There are wars, and then there are lessons, deliberate applications of violence, crafted not to merely destroy, but to teach. The Thramas Crusade was one such lesson, and Jago Sevatarion, first captain of the Night Lords, would write its curriculum in the blood of worlds. The war began, as most do, with a lie. While the Imperium reeled from the shock of Istvan, its communications fractured, its faith shaken, Horus quietly turned his eye toward the galactic northeast. He knew the Dark Angels, first among the legions, eldest of the Emperor's creations, were too dangerous to leave unchallenged, but he also knew they could not be swayed. Lionel Johnson would never bow to chaos, nor sit idle as the galaxy burned. So Horus did what all cowards do when faced with strength. He sent someone else to deal with it. Kurz, ever the blade, Horus refused to stain his own hands with, was ordered to stall the First Legion, not defeat, not destroy. Delay, disrupt, bleed, occupy. Prevent them from reaching Terra, from interfering with the real war. Kurz accepted with the calm of a man who had already foreseen the outcome. Sevatar did not question the order. He didn't care for the political maneuvering behind it. What mattered to him was the purpose. Finally, a campaign worthy of precision. Not a massacre, not a betrayal, but a true conflict, fought in shadow and silence across 100 systems. The Thramas sector had long been a stable, industrious region, home to dozens of compliant worlds, rich in resources and military assets. A place of order. Sevatar despised it instantly. The campaign began with a whisper. Astropathic relays failed, Vox signals garbled, navigators lost their charts. It was not chaos, at least not in the way the word-bearers understood it. This was the Kurz doctrine, in motion, destabilization before invasion. The first official attack came without any declaration of war. A Night Lord's strike cruiser, unspoken, emerged from the void near the orbital platforms of Heraldar Prime and issued a single transmission. The Dark remembers. 10 minutes later, the stations were gone. From there, it escalated. Sevatar took personal command of the strike on Vraxis, a fortress world long rumored to be preparing contingents for Terra's defense. He did not attack the defenses head-on. He poisoned the atmosphere processors, launched decoy distress signals to draw out the fleet, disabled orbital shields just long enough to deploy boarding pods. The Vraxian High Command was captured in their war room, still in uniform, mid-discussion. Sevatar had each one executed with a single swing of Night's Whisper, not out of cruelty, but to make a point. He recorded it, not the violence, the silence that followed, the pause between deaths, the stillness, and he broadcast it to every loyalist-aligned world in Thramas. We are not here for glory. We are not here to parley. We are the shadow between heartbeats. You will not see us coming. You will only hear the silence after we leave. It worked. Worlds began to panic. Some declared neutrality, hoping to be overlooked. Others raised defenses, only to find themselves cut off, isolated, crushed from within. The Dark Angels noticed, and they responded. Lionel Johnson did not rage, he did not posture, he planned. Where Kurz was chaos wrapped in foresight, the Lion was control sharpened to a razored edge. He understood the threat the Night Lords posed, not just to systems, but to morale. He deployed fleets with precision, reinforced communication hubs, and launched counterstrikes that bled the 8th Legion in unexpected places. But Sevatar welcomed it. At last, a foe worth fearing. He studied the Lion's movements, even began to predict them. He saw a mirror of himself in the First Legion's strategy. Cold, efficient, unapologetic, and that made them dangerous. The war became one of attrition and perception. Sevatar waged his battles in void dark corridors and whisper-thin margins. He orchestrated ambushes across solar storms, redirected warp-routed vessels into mined sectors, and infiltrated enemy fleets with Vox mimicry and corrupted command codes. He took pleasure in the challenge, not in the kill, but in the design. Each strike was crafted to send a message. On Polex 2, he allowed the civilian government to flee, only to intercept their escape vessel and strand it in-system, broadcasting its distress signal on all frequencies as the Night Lords firebombed the surface below. On the moon of Korovin, he left a single survivor from a command garrison, blind, deaf, and bound, placed at the entrance of the next world's capital spire. The man bore only a single marking etched into his flesh. He watched, but the lion learned quickly. The Dark Angels began to adapt. Where once they would respond to attacks, they now preempted them. Their ships began moving in unpredictable patterns, deploying false convoys to bait ambushes. Entire squadrons of Interemptors were redirected to hunt down Night Lords boarding teams before they could cause damage. One such strike came close to ending Sevatar's life. On the station of Cathelis Reach, a decoy war council was set up as bait. Sevatar took it anyway. He knew it was a trap, and he went in with his blades drawn. The fight was brutal. Dark Angels in sealed void armor clashed with the Atramentar in narrow corridors. Vox silence. No quarter. Sevatar killed 9 before being pinned beneath a collapsing blast door. His armor sealed, bones cracked, vision blurred, but he survived. Pulled from the wreckage by a junior Atramentar, his first act upon regaining consciousness was to execute the last wounded Dark Angel with a headbutt. Then he laughed, quietly. The Atramentar said nothing, because it wasn't triumph. It was respect. The lion had almost killed him, and that meant the war was real now, and it would only escalate. As the Thramas Crusade entered its second year, both sides adapted into monsters of their own making. The Night Lords grew more precise, the Dark Angels more ruthless. Entire planets became graveyards without ever seeing an invasion. Both legions learned to anticipate the other's movements so well that some battles were never fought, only predicted and averted, because the outcomes had already been calculated. It was in these moments that Sevatar became something more than a killer. He became a strategist, not in the broad sweeping sense of war masters and primarchs, but in the personalized calculus of disruption. He turned the war into a private game of death chess with the lion, baiting him into reaction, forcing him to respond. And slowly, methodically, he began to win. But even as the Night Lords bled their enemies, Sevatar felt something else creeping into the war, a change in the tone of the Legion itself. Some of the captains began to overindulge. The raids became more chaotic, the terror more erratic. Where Sevatar sought clarity and fear with purpose, others began to worship the suffering itself. He killed one of them on Karanix, Captain Val Neres, who had crucified an entire city sector upside down. Sevatar dragged him from his command bunker, beat him senseless in front of his own men, and whispered, "This is not madness. This is a lesson." Nares died screaming. The Chiroptera never questioned it. Sevatar knew then what he had always suspected. The Night Lords didn't need leadership. They needed reminders. Reminders of what they were meant to be. Not demons, not sadists, not howling madmen, but judges. Carriers of punishment so complete, so absolute, that no one would ever think of resisting them again. The Thramas Crusade was not just a war of attrition. It was a war for the soul of the Night Lord's Legion, and Sevatar would carve that soul into iron, one system at a time. Some meetings begin with protocol, some with ceremony. The one on Sagwalsa began with silence and ended with blood. By the third year of the Thramas Crusade, the Night Lords and Dark Angels had carved a graveyard through the sector. Systems had burned, fleets shattered, and neither side could claim true victory. The war was not static, but circular, a grinding repetition of ambushes, raids, and counterstrikes. Every time the Dark Angels cornered their prey, the Night Lords vanished into the void. And every time the Night Lords struck, the First Legion answered with retaliatory fury. Something had to break. That something, as ever, came from the Night Haunter. It was Conrad Kurz who proposed the parley. He left a single encrypted astropathic message, one that only the Lion could decode. It contained no threats, no rhetoric, just coordinates. Sagualza, and a time. The Lion, against the advice of his lieutenants, accepted, because he understood his enemy, and more dangerously, Kurz understood him. Sevatar received the news on the nightfall without visible reaction, but behind the eyes of his skull-faced helm, gears turned. The idea of Kurz speaking with the Lion was absurd, predictable, dangerous, inevitable. Kurz didn't consult his captains, he never did, but he chose who would stand beside him, and as always, he chose Sevatar. It wasn't a compliment, it was a necessity. Only Sevatar could be trusted to read the flow of a confrontation and act without hesitation. Not just to fight, but to end it. If things soured, Sevatar would be the knife that severed negotiations in blood. The chosen four descended. Kurz, Sevatar, and Captain Shang, the Legion's quiet voice of restraint. The Dark Angels arrived in mirrored symmetry. Lion L. Johnson, Master Alajos, and Paladin Corswain, all clad in ceremonial plate, their presence carved from iron discipline. The location was neutral, a shattered colonnade beneath Tsagualsei's twilight skies. The columns leaned like broken teeth, scorched by orbital strikes. Vines grew where civilization had once ruled. It was a place of ruins, and fitting for the moment. The parley began with posture. Kurz stood draped in darkness, face half-shrouded in the tattered remnants of a cloak that had never been regal. He was gaunt, sleepless, with eyes that burned, not with purpose, but certainty. He looked at the Lion the way a tomb looks at the man who carved its name. L. Johnson was everything Kurz was not, composed, clean, noble. Where Kurz moved like a whisper through dust, the Lion stood like a fortress carved into time. The contrast between them was stark, but neither flinched. Sevatar remained behind Kurz's right shoulder, Shang to the left. They stood motionless. So did Corswain and Alajos, eyes locked on their Night Lord counterparts. Tension did not build. It arrived, fully formed, like a weight on the throat of the world. Kurz spoke first. "You've come a long way, brother." L. Johnson's voice was measured. "Not far enough." There were no pleasantries, no warm remembrances of shared blood, only the acknowledgement of what they had become, reflections of differing philosophies that no longer had room to coexist. They argued, but not in the way mortals argue. Every word carried the weight of legions. Every glance was a blade half-drawn. Kurz spoke of the Emperor's hypocrisy, of how terror worked where honor failed, how justice meant nothing without consequence. He did not ask the Lion to join Horus. He didn't plead. He simply stated the truth as he saw it. The Lion countered with logic, with strategy, with law. He argued that Kurz's actions had damned his sons to oblivion, that the Emperor's vision was the only stable future, flawed as it was. He didn't threaten. He simply reminded Kurz that death awaited those who chose rebellion. Behind them, the warriors shifted. Sevatar watched Corswain with the eyes of a predator. Corswain, to his credit, returned the stare without blinking. Both understood something their primarchs could not articulate. This was not diplomacy. This was foreplay for war. The tension cracked when Corswain's gaze fell to Sevatar's gauntlets, painted a deep arterial red. Not fresh blood. Symbolic. "What's that meant to be?" Corswain asked, voice low. Sevatar answered without turning his head. "Shame," Corswain sneered. "You admit it?" "I wear it." "What for?" Sevatar turned fully to face him. "Because I failed him, and now I pay." Corswain's expression darkened. "Then you're either loyal or a fool." Sevatar smiled beneath his helm. Both. Corswain's hand drifted to his hilt. Shang stepped forward slightly. The parlay teetered. Kurz raised one hand. So did the lion. The warriors froze, but the moment hung, like a knife suspended above a throat, waiting for gravity to remember its duty. Then the lion said something Kurz did not expect. "You don't have to die like this." Kurz's reply was a whisper. "I've already seen how I die." That was when it broke. Kurz lunged. L. Johnson drew his blade in the same breath. Steel met steel. The Primarchs collided like thunder. Kurz a flurry of rage and vision. The lion a bastion of technique and fury. They moved with the speed of gods, their blades striking faster than the eye could follow. Behind them, the bodyguards ignited. Corswin drew and met Sevatar head-on. They had fought before, on other worlds, in other moments. But this time there was no pretense, no restraint. Their duel was the clash of ideologies wearing armor. Sevatar was fast, vicious, and mocking. Corswin was clean, precise, and unyielding. They traded blows under collapsing pillars, their footwork grinding dust into the floor. Sevatar taunted. Corswin ignored. Sparks flew, blood sprayed. But neither gave ground. Nearby, Shang and Alahos dueled with equal brutality. Then came the scream. Kurz had driven his talons deep into the lion's side. The Dark Angel staggered, armor splitting. But before Kurz could finish him, Alahos broke from his duel, hurling himself between the Primarchs. His blade sank into Kurz's ribs. The Night Haunter howled, not in pain, but wrath. He threw Alahos aside like a doll. Sevatar saw it happen, saw his Primarch bleed, saw the knight who dared strike him collapse in a heap, and Sevatar acted. He broke from Corswin's clash with a burst of speed, dodging a retaliatory swing by inches. He crossed the blood-slick ground in 3 strides and brought Night's Whisper down in a clean, brutal arc. Alahos's head rolled across the stones. Sevatar didn't gloat. He simply stood over the corpse. "I promised I'd take it," he said. Corswin roared and charged, but Kurz, still reeling from the wound, let out a shriek of command. Shang dragged Sevatar back just as Corswin's blade grazed his pauldron. Then the ships arrived. Both legions had prepared for this outcome. Vox signals flared. Dropships screamed through the atmosphere. Thousands of warriors from both sides descended toward the colonnade. The parley was over. Kurz and his sons vanished into the shadowy ruins, taking their wounded Primarch with them. The Dark Angels regrouped under a rain of debris and orbital fire. Neither side claimed victory. Neither side wanted it. The war had not paused. It had deepened. Later, aboard the Nightfall, Sevatar stood alone in the stasis vault, looking down at the severed head of Alahos, now kept in a pressure-locked case. It wasn't pride that filled him. It was confirmation. There was no peace to be brokered, no middle ground. The lion had drawn blood. Kurz had shed it. Sevatar had claimed it. And now the Thramas crusade would burn brighter than ever, because the masks had fallen, and beneath them there were only monsters with names. Sevatar never underestimated the lion. He had seen too many commanders mistake L. Johnson's calm for hesitation, his stillness for weakness. Those men didn't live long. The lion was not a hammer like Russ, nor a hurricane like Angron. He was calculation shaped into flesh, a tactician who studied his prey for as long as needed and struck only when the blade would sink deepest. And now, in the scorched heart of the Thramas sector, the lion prepared to drive that blade straight through the Night Lord's spine. The ambush began with a whisper, small irregularities in long-range Vox patterns, missing patrols that should have returned, transient sensor ghosts. Sevatar noticed them, of course. He always noticed. But the signs were subtle. Too subtle. The Nightfall's augurs reported debris fields, wrecked ships, dying transponders, drifting hulls, all signs of a losing battle. But none of those signals belonged to the Dark Angels. They were planted. The Lion had crafted a story, one that told Sevatar exactly what he wanted to believe, that the First Legion was pulling back, retreating from Thramas after the parley on Sagualsa collapsed in blood. It made sense. The Lion had been wounded, his captains demoralized. Strategically, the Thramas sector held limited tactical value. The Night Lord's terror tactics had kept the First Legion bogged down for years. A withdrawal was logical, which was why Sevatar knew it was a lie. But he had to play the game. He deployed scout squadrons along the projected escape vector of the Dark Angels' fleet, rotating through systems they would likely pass. His Atramentar ships were stretched thin, skipping between shadows, sniffing for signs of retreating vessels. Then came the report. The system of Sheol Ninin, a gas giant flanked by scorched mining moons, once loyal to the Mechanicum, now long abandoned, pinged with evidence of a fleeing strike cruiser. It was bait, and Sevatar bit. The Nightfall led the detachment into the Sheol system with surgical timing, accompanied by 6 cruisers and 2 destroyer escorts. He kept the fleet in a tight veil formation, anticipating trouble. He didn't trust the sudden opportunity, but Kurz had ordered pursuit, and orders from the Night Haunter were never to be ignored. They arrived to find the strike cruiser listing, lights flickering, broadcasting a distress signal on open Vox. Sevatar watched it through the void glass from the bridge, arms folded. Too obvious, he murmured. And then came the old trap. The void shifted. Debris fields shimmered and collapsed, revealing hidden ships. The Dark Angels' fleet materialized in silence. No Vox broadcasts, no trumpet calls, just mass reactive engines igniting like wolves stepping from fog. They had been waiting. The Lion had baited them into a killing zone, pre-calculated firing vectors, overlapping kill fields, and full-spectrum jamming. Lance fire erupted from the flanks, slamming into the Nightfall's void shields. In the first 2 minutes, a Night Lord's cruiser was torn in half, its engines punctured and spilling plasma like entrails. Sevatar's response was immediate. He didn't panic. He didn't shout. He activated his command relay and spoke 5 words. Talon pattern. Wings to break. The Atramentar fleet dispersed into a scattering formation, decoys and countermeasures deployed like glittering chaff. Sevatar didn't believe in static formations. His ships were predators, and predators never moved in straight lines. But the Lion had predicted this. The Dark Angels mirrored the maneuver perfectly, cutting off the Night Lord's egress corridors with brutal precision. Boarding torpedoes launched from hidden silos embedded in asteroids, another trap within a trap. Sevatar knew then, this wasn't just a battle. It was personal. El Johnson hadn't come to destroy the Night Lord's fleet. He had come to kill Conrad Kurz, and for a brief, chilling moment, he succeeded. Aboard the Nightfall, the bridge buckled under impact. Fire crews scrambled as bulkheads cracked and artificial gravity fluctuated. Sevatar ordered a counterstrike, targeting lance batteries to suppress the largest Dark Angels vessels. But it was too late. Another Vox signal came through. No encryption, just a single word from a sister ship. The Primarch has fallen. Kurz had been aboard a forward strike frigate, coordinating the approach vector. A Dark Angels boarding party had reached the bridge. El Johnson himself was with them. The 2 Primarchs had clashed again, blade to claw, steel to madness. And this time the Lion won. Conrad Kurz had been struck down, his ribcage shattered, one of his secondary hearts punctured. The word-bearers would have called it divine judgment. Sevatar called it unacceptable. When he heard the report, he didn't scream. He didn't tremble. He walked to the teleportarium and ordered his remaining Atramentar to gather. "We are going to retrieve our Gene Father," he said, "or we will die on the attempt." The next minutes were chaos. Sevatar's Terminator-clad warriors boarded the crippled flagship under a hail of fire, punching through Dark Angel's resistance with brutal, focused violence. Sevatar fought like a man who refused to allow fate to finish its sentence. His chain glaive sang through the corridors of the dying ship. He tore through interruptors, gutted blade guard, and severed power conduits to blind the enemy's advance. He reached the Apothecarion where Kurz lay, surrounded by a dozen Night Lords forming a protective cordon. The Primarch was barely alive, body shattered, face pale and bloodless. His breathing was shallow. His eyes flickered but saw nothing. "Get him out," Sevatar growled. They teleported back with seconds to spare. The Nightfall had suffered massive internal damage, but its engines still screamed with stolen fury. The fleet retreated. What was left of it? They left behind wreckage, dead brothers, and a lesson carved in fire. The Dark Angels had proven they could win. The Thramma's crusade had changed. What had once been raids and strikes was now open war. Sevatar stood by Kurz's stasis chamber after the retreat. The Primarch was comatose, locked in Medici fields and life support coils. His body was broken, but not dead. Not yet. The Chiroptera was in disarray. The Legion was fracturing. Dozens of senior commanders were gone, dead, captured, or cut off during the retreat. Only the Iron-Willed remained. Only those too stubborn to let go of the war. Sevatar, bloodied and burned, stood before them. He said nothing for a long time. Then, with the eyes of the Atramentar upon him, he spoke. "We do not mourn. Silence. We endure." He turned, gaze sweeping across his commanders. "The Lion thinks we're broken. He thinks we've fallen." He raised Night's whisper. "He's half right." A pause. "But so is this blade, and it's still sharp." And with those words, Sevatar assumed more than leadership. He assumed burden. The Night Haunter was down. The Night Lords needed a will, and Jago Sevatarion, battered but unbroken, took it for his own. Not for glory, not for vengeance, but for continuity. Because while Kurz slept, the war could not. And Sevatar would make sure that the dark kept moving. The bridge of the Nightfall was unnervingly quiet. Its command dais, once filled with strategium officers, Chiropteran captains, and Kurz himself, now stood empty. Red light pulsed from damaged consoles. Smoke coiled through fractured bulkheads. The silence wasn't peace. It was aftermath. Konrad Kurz lay in stasis, his broken form sealed behind grav-suspended Medicae glass. He had not spoken since the lion's blade tore through his ribs and caved in part of his chest. His heartbeat flickered only under the stabilizing field. No command passed his lips. No prophecy escaped his mind, and the Night Lord's Legion drifted toward collapse. The remnants of the fleet gathered in an unstable orbit above the dead world of Velior. Fragments of Kurz's once formidable forces limped in from across the Thrammas sector, battered, leaderless, many too damaged to ever fight again. The Chiroptera, the Legion's elite circle of warlords, had been gutted. Of those who remained, most had begun to whisper. Some whispered mutiny, some whispered of fleeing, and some whispered of things darker still, of giving in to the same madness that had consumed Kurz. Jago Sevatarion, first captain, heard it all, and he said nothing. Not yet. He spent 3 days walking the decks of the Nightfall, dressed not in full armor, but in the light black carapace of a Nostraman officer's coat. He watched the mortal crew maintain power to life support. He watched Atramentar survivors clean dried blood from the bulkheads. He watched new recruits whisper prayers to things they did not understand. On the 4th day, he called a meeting. Not in the War Council chamber, in the firing range. One by one, the surviving captains arrived. Most wore damaged armor. Some still bore the burns of boarding actions. All of them looked at Sevatar with a mixture of anticipation and calculation. They wanted to see if he would blink. He didn't. He stood beside the corpses of Malithos Kuln and Sel Herek, two captains who had, just hours earlier, suggested the Legion retreat to the Maelstrom and abandon the war entirely. Their heads were gone, their bodies cooling. Sevatar let that image do most of the talking, but then he stepped forward. No Chiroptera, no prophecy, no Primarch. He paused. No excuses. He looked across the room, eyes sharp beneath the pale blue lens of his helm. We are not lost. We are awake. And if you think for 1 second that this Legion is a corpse to be buried or bartered, you will join Kuln and Herek, headless. Silence. Then Sevatar drew Night's Whisper and plunged it into the deck plating, the whine of the blade's teeth, slowing as they sank into metal. He left it there, and he turned his back on them. That was the day Jago Sevatarion became the de facto master of the Night Lords. He didn't claim the title. He didn't kneel on any dais or take a crown. The Legion didn't work that way, but command is not about ritual. It's about momentum, and Sevatar had seized it. The reorganization began at once. He knew they could not continue the war in traditional formations. The fleet was too damaged, supply lines too severed. So he fractured the Legion by design, dividing it into 6 autonomous flotillas, each led by a captain he personally vetted. Each flotilla had a specific function: sabotage, fleet interdiction, psychological operations, infiltration, precision strikes, and civil suppression. He turned the 8th Legion into a network, a dispersed shadow across Thramas, able to strike in dozens of places at once, confuse sensors, overload response forces, and retreat into the void before retribution could be organized. He gave them names. Not code numbers, but predator names. The Red Talon, the Hollow Claw, the Crow's Wing. Each flotilla received a symbol and creed drawn from Nostraman folklore. Each was given full autonomy under Sevatar's loose command. It was not a political move. It was a trap. He knew some would test him, try to take their newfound freedom as license to indulge in slaughter for its own sake, to chase demons and warp things like the Word-Bearers did. Sevatar let them believe it. Then he waited. When Captain Drell Voro of the Hollow Claw desecrated a Mechanicum temple world for the thrill of it, slaughtering tech adepts without purpose and transmitting their deaths to other legions for amusement, Sevatar boarded his ship personally. It was a massacre. He didn't bring an honor guard. He didn't give a speech. He simply activated his teleport homer, appeared on the bridge, and killed 27 Astartes in 22 seconds. He left Voro alive. Barely. He removed his eyes, his tongue, and hung him by iron spikes in the strategium as a permanent navigational marker. He then assumed command of the Hollow Claw himself for 3 weeks, until he was certain the remaining officers understood what command meant. The message was clear. You had freedom, but only until it got in the way of results. And then you had Sevatar. But while he held the Legion together with one hand, the other was shaking. Because Sevatar was changing. Something had awoken inside him. It began subtly. A shiver in his fingertips before battles, a buzzing in his teeth when he stood near the stasis pod containing Kurz. Then came the flashes, glimpses of events, before they happened. The ability to sense intention, to feel thoughts like currents in a storm. He tried to ignore it, until he couldn't. The psychic talent he had buried for decades, repressed out of pride and disgust, had clawed its way to the surface. He began to feel his brother's thoughts, hear fragments of their voices in his mind. At first, it was useful, predictive, tactical. He used it to guide his strikes, to anticipate assassins, to counter fleet movements. But then the dreams returned, not his dreams. Kurz's. Visions of dying stars, a golden throne of rot, his own face, bound in chains, blood streaming from his sockets. Sevatar couldn't sleep. So he made a decision. He would confront it. He entered the Medicae stasis chamber in the Nightfall's core, alone. Kurz floated in suspension, still pale, still unconscious. Sevatar removed his helm, placed his palm against the stasis field, and whispered, "I need you to wake up." Nothing. The hum of life support, the flicker of medical runes. So Sevatar closed his eyes and opened his mind. For the first time in his life, he reached into the warp, not to call for help, not to draw power, but to reach his father. He found darkness. And then, screaming, visions of Nostromo splitting apart, Sevatar standing alone on a bridge of broken iron, his legion in ruins, his name erased. He saw fire, he saw betrayal, and then he saw Kurze, awake, eyes like void rifts, smiling. "Welcome back," Kurze said. "I missed you." Then Sevatar screamed. The psychic backlash knocked him across the chamber. He hit the wall, vomited blood, and blacked out. When he awoke, his skin was burned where his mind had touched Kurz's. He didn't speak of it to anyone, but he knew something now. Kurz wasn't sleeping. He was waiting. And now he knew Sevatar was trying to lead in his place, perhaps even to replace him. And Sevatar, for all his defiance, felt the weight of it settle on his chest like an executioner's hand. But he stood anyway, because the Legion needed leadership. And if the only price for that was his soul, then Sevatarion would pay it, in silence, with precision, with blood. Even in darkness, war takes on rhythm. For the Night Lords, that rhythm was always brutal, a staccato beat of screams and bloodshed, of broken worlds and broken men. But in the wake of Kurz's fall and Sevatar's rise, the 8th Legion no longer marched to one song. It became a discordant chorus. Each warband played its own note, and Sevatar, the reluctant conductor, had to shape chaos into symphony, or die trying. The Thramma's crusade hadn't ended, it had mutated. With the Dark Angels pushing deeper into the sector, Sevatar led a campaign not of resistance, but of disintegration. He didn't hold territory. He made the very concept of territory meaningless. He turned inhabited systems into death traps, booby-trapped planets, rigged vox beacons, and false distress calls. When the Dark Angels sent relief, they found entire hives filled with corpses, scripted sermons of vengeance carved into ferrocrete, and Atramentar waiting in ambush. But this wasn't warfare in the classic sense. It was a butcher's war. And it was about to tear the Night Lords apart from within. The first signs came with Captain Cale Thorn, a survivor of the Istvan betrayal. Thorn's warband, the Eben Verge, had always towed the line between terror tactics and open sadism. Sevatar tolerated them, barely. They served a function, indiscriminate punishment, the kind that made entire populations kneel at the mere mention of Night Lords. Thorn had been given free rein in the subsector of Vectress, tasked with destabilizing local loyalist resistance. What Sevatar hadn't authorized was the ritualistic immolation of 1 billion souls. Thorn turned the industrial world of Morian Prime into a pyre, using atmospheric fuel and viral agents to burn every living creature from orbit. When his warband broadcast the scream system-wide, overlaying the Voxnet with mantras praising the new Nostromo reborn. Sevatar realized the line had not just been crossed, it had been obliterated. And the 8th Legion had started to become what the Imperium always said it was. That night, Sevatar convened a meeting, not with the full Chiroptera, which no longer truly existed, but with 6 captains he still trusted, or at least trusted enough not to backstab him mid-sentence. He didn't speak from a throne. He spoke from the prow of the Nightfall, standing beside a viewport overlooking the charred husk of Morian Prime. "This isn't terror," Sevatar said. "It's madness." Captain Valis of the Vanta Black Wing leaned forward, helm off, scarred face tight with irritation. "You gave them autonomy." "I gave them direction," Sevatar countered. "They spat in my face and burned the map." He looked to the others. "We are not word-bearers. We are not world-eaters. We are not gods, and we are not berserkers. We are fear, weaponized and sharpened. If we become animals, then we lose the only edge we have left." There was silence. No one disagreed. But Sevatar knew what they were thinking. He couldn't police all of them. And he didn't have to. He just needed to make an example. He chose Vectress 3, Thorn's forward bastion. The Ebon Verge didn't expect Sevatar to strike his own brothers. But then they had forgotten something essential. Sevatar didn't consider them brothers anymore. The Nightfall dropped from the warp at high velocity, its guns already hot. 3 Atramentar strike cruisers followed, loaded with boarding teams. Sevatar led the assault himself, clad in full warplate, his helm shaped like a skull crowned with a stylized murder of crows. He didn't give a speech. He didn't broadcast threats. He just started killing. The fortress monastery of the Ebon Verge fell in 24 minutes. Sevatar and the Atramentar moved like a viral blade through the halls, precise, silent, unrelenting. It wasn't about theatrics, it was about surgical punishment. He didn't simply execute Cale Thorn. He made him watch as his inner circle were each slain, one by one, without ceremony, without trial. Only after that did he address Thorn. "You think you understand fear?" Sevatar said. Thorn spat blood, one eye swollen shut. "I am fear." Sevatar leaned in close. "Number, you're a liability." He severed Thorn's head and left it atop his own throne, still twitching. That message echoed louder than any terror broadcast, but Sevatar's purge wasn't about vengeance. It was about reasserting identity. Because in truth, the Night Lords were starting to forget who they were. Too many now worshipped chaos, if not in word, then in deed. Not openly, never openly, but the signs were there. Battle cries invoking the warp, captains adorned in skin-bound scrolls, the slow integration of heretical iconography into Legion regalia. Sevatar hated it. He had never bowed to gods. He had bowed to results. He called it amateur hour, using demon engines like crutches, sacrificing control for spectacle. And though he didn't say it aloud, he feared what Kurz's silence truly meant, that the Night Haunter had seen the Legion slipping beyond reclamation. So Sevatar made a choice, a brutal, final one. He began sending kill orders, not to loyalist worlds, but to traitor elements within his own Legion. Small teams of Atramentar were dispatched across the sector. Their targets were former captains who had gone rogue, ones who wore the warp too close to the skin, ones who had abandoned discipline for madness. Each kill was documented, recorded, and quietly shared through encrypted Vox channels. The message: we clean our own blood. Yet, with every rogue warband put down, Sevatar knew the Legion was bleeding faster than he could cauterize. And then, one night, he dreamed. He stood in the ruins of Nostromo. The skies were ash. A golden figure sat on a throne of corpses, a sword across his lap. Kur stood behind it, whispering in the Emperor's ear. And Sevatar, face flayed open, chainglaive shattered, knelt before them both. "Why?" he asked. "Because you still care," Kurz answered. He awoke gasping, soaked in sweat, the pain behind his eyes like a crow picking at his skull. He didn't sleep again for days. Instead, he began to compile the Legion Register, a list of every remaining warband, every known asset, ship, supply depot, and Astartes' body. He organized what little remained of Central Command into a makeshift Legion Remnant Authority. Part intelligence network, part execution squad. It was the final stage of his consolidation. The Night Lords had no empire, but Sevatar gave them a ledger, and with that ledger he gave them purpose again. Not honor, not salvation, just order. Blood-slick, shadow-bound order. But it wasn't enough, because he knew what was coming. The tide was turning. The siege of Terra was approaching. The Night Lords had to decide, return to the War Master's call, or remain wild wolves in the void. And though Sevatar still claimed no title, no rank beyond First Captain, he would have to choose for them. And whatever choice he made, he knew it would damn them either way. The Thrammas Crusade was nearing its terminus. Across the stars of the sector, embers drifted in the void like the dying breath of an empire. Planets that had once known order and imperial doctrine now teetered between ruin and paranoia, shadows dancing at the edge of every orbital platform. The Night Lords had succeeded in their task. They had delayed the Dark Angels. They had fractured control, but they had also fractured themselves. Jago Sevatarion had kept the Legion from sliding entirely into madness, barely. He had beaten it back with blade, will, and the occasional execution. Yet he knew something the others didn't, or at least refused to say aloud. This war was over. Not in victory, not in defeat, just exhaustion. And it was time to leave. But leaving the Thramma sector wasn't as simple as slipping back into the void. The Dark Angels were no longer content to hunt. They had become executioners. The Lion, ever relentless, had tightened his grip across the stars, redeploying his forces into pincer formations that threatened to box in the last Night Lord's flotillas. If Sevatar didn't act soon, the 8th Legion would be cut off permanently, doomed to die in a corner of the galaxy most of the Imperium had already forgotten. And so Sevatar prepared his final move. Not a battle, not a retreat, a feint. The plan began with the false signal from Calixis Prime, a way station known for its long-dead void ship repair yards. Sevatar had Atramentar strike teams deploy modified Vox Echoes using salvaged Dark Angels encryption, simulating emergency transmission codes. The broadcast was subtle, a supposed call for reinforcement from a beleaguered loyalist fleet under siege from traitor elements. It was bait. The Lion would have to investigate. He was too cautious to ignore a faltering Imperial garrison, especially one so close to the route between Thrammas and Terra. And investigate he did. The Dark Angels redeployed 3 strike cruisers and 2 support vessels. That alone would have meant nothing until the interception. Sevatar had anticipated this. As the Dark Angels entered the Calixis system, they encountered a fleet of Night Lord ships, seemingly uncoordinated, arrayed in loose formation, desperate, half-damaged, erratic in their attack vectors. The initial skirmish was fast and ugly. One Dark Angel ship, the Glory of Caradon, was disabled within minutes, its engines shredded by mass driver fire. But something was off. The Night Lords didn't press their advantage. They scattered. The Lion, ever wary, deployed more ships, enough to press the perceived advantage and break the remaining traitors. He was still thinking, tactically, still calculating. But Sevatar had moved beyond tactics. This wasn't about killing. This was about escape. As the Lion committed more and more of his fleet to the Calixis zone, Sevatar enacted the real plan. 3 systems away, deep in the Oribus belt, every surviving Night Lord's vessel under his authority began to withdraw, quietly, efficiently, under jamming fields and solar flare cover. They were gone before the Dark Angels even realized the Night Lords hadn't been fighting at Calixis. They had been stalling. The fleet used a scattering maneuver, deploying independent warp jumps across separate trajectories. There would be no single rally point, no bottleneck for the Lion to exploit. This was the last feint, and it worked. For a time, but no escape is clean. The Atramentar vessel, Ghost Gale, was caught in the tail end of the withdrawal, forced to re-engage to protect the exfiltrating Nightfall. The Ghost Gale's captain, Balek Vor, had been one of Sevatar's most loyal commanders, a pragmatist, a killer, but not a fanatic. His death was a price Sevatar had been willing to pay. He felt no joy in the loss, but he didn't flinch, because he couldn't afford to. Even as the Night Lords scattered into the warp, Sevatar knew this was no victory. It was survival. The kind of survival that tasted like rust and sounded like the slow toll of a bell ringing out over ruined battlements. He had preserved something vital, the Legion's core. Not its ideals, not its glory, but its continuance. They would not burn out in Thramas. They would not die forgotten in the dark. They would endure, but at a cost. The Nightfall, flagship of Kurz and the Legion both, was crippled in the escape. Warp translation damaged half its structure, fire tore through 3 decks, and worst of all, Kurz's stasis chamber flickered for 3 full minutes during the jump, long enough for the Primarch to awaken in agony before falling unconscious again. Sevatar didn't speak of it. He ordered the chamber sealed. Not out of fear, but uncertainty. He had seen Kurz's eyes in that moment. No hate, no rage, just acceptance. As if the Night Haunter had always known the Thramas crusade would end like this. Sevatar sat alone in his quarters that night, armor removed, chain glaive across his lap. He ran his gloved fingers along its teeth, eyes unfocused. The Legion was alive, but it wasn't united. What remained were war bands, cells of killers with differing priorities and loyalties. Some respected him, others feared him. Some called him the true leader of the Night Lords now. Others whispered of Kurz's return, of old prophecies rekindled. Sevatar neither accepted nor denied any of it. He simply stared at the dark between the stars and whispered, "Let them come." For all his defiance, he knew he was tired. Tired of the games, tired of the burden, tired of making the correct decision when everyone else sought only carnage. He hadn't wanted command. He hadn't asked for it. He had taken it because someone had to, because Kurz couldn't. And yet a sliver of doubt remained, one he couldn't carve away with any blade. What if all of this had simply delayed the inevitable? What if the Night Lords were already dead, and he was just the last man at the funeral, nailing shut the casket? And then came the report. One of the fleeing ships, the Charybdis vein, had disappeared in the warp. Its last transmission was a garbled shriek of corrupted Vox, chanting in Nostraman dialect, overlapped with warp echoes, and a voice Sevatar recognized, his own, laughing. He played the recording 6 times. On the 7th, he deleted it. Because if it was true, if something else had been writing their escape, then the war hadn't ended. It had simply changed masks, and Sevatar would be ready. The last feint had given the Night Lords time, nothing more. But for men like Jago Sevatarion, time was a blade, and he would wield it until the very end. The warp had a way of distorting more than time and space. It corrupted loyalty, blurred intent, and made monsters of brothers. In the days following the Thramas withdrawal, Sevatar found himself less a warlord and more a warden, holding back a rising tide of lunacy within his own legion. The Night Lords were scattered, disillusioned, and wounded, but worse, they were changing. Not all of them had followed Sevatar's disciplined war of terror. Not all saw order as a virtue. Many had come to see the warp as liberation, freedom from command, from logic, from restraint. It began in whispers. Then the symbols appeared, etched onto armor, burned into skin, woven into banners that should never have flown aboard Night Lords' vessels. Gods were being spoken of openly now. Powers offered deals that desperate minds accepted too easily. Sevatar knew what it meant. The Legion was fracturing again, this time not from circumstance or necessity, but from within. It began with Captain Varian Akaran, once a reliable butcher. Akaran had gone silent after the retreat, his ship, the Eviscerator's Oath, failing to check in for over a month. When Sevatar finally located him, orbiting the void-ruined mining station of Ceres 5, the Vox transmissions were wrong. There were chants on all channels, screams looped into static, words that stung even through encrypted ciphers. Sevatar led the boarding team himself, accompanied by 5 Atramentar veterans. The inside of the Eviscerator's Oath was a cathedral of madness. Flayed bodies hung from ceiling chains. The walls had been turned into canvases of skin, painted in black and blue gore. Akaran's bridge had no command throne. Instead, it held a circle of blades, and in its center, the broken remains of the ship's navigator, his third eye carved open and lined with wax candles. Akaran stood above the body, arms raised, whispering names that twisted in the mind like hooks. Sevatar put a bolt round through his helm, not out of rage, out of necessity. When they returned to the Nightfall, Sevatar locked himself in the Strategium. He played the ship's final logs in sequence. Akaran had been exposed to a demon trapped in Ceres's mining core, one sealed long ago by the Ordo Reductor. The entity had offered him visions, promises of eternal vengeance. He had accepted, and so had others. 3 more captains disappeared over the following weeks. When Sevatar traced their warp trails, they led not toward Terra or any major war zone, but deeper into the Eye of Terror, deeper into corruption. This wasn't just deviation, it was betrayal. And Sevatar, for all his cynicism, had not anticipated its depth. He still believed in the core of the Legion, not its morals, but its methodology. Fear as a weapon, precision as creed. That was the Night Lord's identity. To see it eroded by warp-mad cultists made something old and sharp stir in his gut. He had spent years killing enemies of the Imperium. Now, for the first time since Istvan, he realized he would have to start killing his own ass. He convened a council, not with warbands, but with individuals. The most stable, the most reliable, the ones who had not bowed to the warp. From them he forged a silent pact. They called themselves the Remnant. Not a new order, not a rebellion, just a promise to preserve what remained of the true Night Lords. They operated in pairs and trios, moving from fleet to fleet, warband to warband, observing. When signs of worship or corruption emerged, unsanctioned rituals, warp glyphs, demonic behavior, they acted without fanfare, sometimes with a blade, sometimes with fire. Sevatar authorized all of it. Not because he believed in loyalty anymore, but because he feared what the Legion was becoming in its absence. And then came the message. It was not from a Night Lord. It was from Ezekiel Abaddon, the Despoiler, first captain of the Sons of Horus, voice of the War Master. The message was clear: Terra would burn. The final assault had begun. The arch-traitor Horus was calling his sons to the cradle of humanity. The great reckoning was here. All legions were expected to make their way toward Sol. Sevatar played the message 3 times, then deleted it. He told no one, because he already knew the answer. They wouldn't go, not because they lacked the will, because they lacked the unity. Too many Night Lords had already given themselves to chaos. Too many more had drifted into private wars, chasing vengeance or indulgence. If they traveled to Terra now, they would arrive not as an army, but as an infection. And Sevatar had no interest in letting the galaxy remember the Night Lords that way. Still, some ships did begin the journey. Without orders, without coordination, and Sevatar watched them go. He said nothing, but when Captain Alvaric Darvesh, leader of the warband Hollow Grin, attempted to commandeer 3 cruisers from the Nightfall's orbital dock for the Terra campaign, Sevatar intervened. He met Darvesh in the hangar bay. No helmet, no armor, just a sword in hand. "You can go," Sevatar said, voice low, "but you won't take my ships." Darvesh sneered. "I don't take orders from the crippled ghost of Nostramo." Sevatar's sword was through his heart before the insult finished. The duel wasn't a duel. It was a warning. And that night, Sevatar sent a final encrypted message across the entire fleet. No address, no name, just a voice. "We are not gods. We are not warlords. We are weapons. If you forget that, you will be removed." It was the last message many ever received from him, because the very next day a trap was sprung. A warband Sevatar had once trusted. The charnel blades lured him into a supposed supply rendezvous at the ruins of Helska Majoris. They betrayed him. They came with sorcerers, with warp-tainted relics, with a dozen demon-bound warriors eager to claim the head of the one who refused to kneel. Sevatar fought like the end of all things. His chainglaive tore through 3 sorcerers in the first 2 minutes. He decapitated a Terminator while still spinning from a parry. He was poetry, a cyclone of carnage and clarity, the last echo of Nostraman precision. But there were too many. And when he was finally brought down, it was not by strength. It was by betrayal. A knife in the back. The last thing he saw before losing consciousness was the face of a brother he'd once saved from an Imperial kill team on Gathis Minor, smiling. When he awoke, he was bound in chains, armor gone, vision blurred. And the cell was not made of steel. It was made of bone. And the whispers in the dark, they didn't belong to mortals. They belonged to something else. But Sevatar didn't scream. He didn't curse. He just sat still, waiting. Because even now, even in darkness, Jago Sevatarion endured. The Night Lords may have turned their backs on Brotherhood, but he hadn't. Not yet. There is a silence beyond silence, a stillness that presses against the mind like cold stone against skin. Jago Sevatarion awoke to that kind of silence. His body ached in ways he had no words for. The air, or whatever passed for it in this warped prison, was thick with incense and the copper sting of old blood. He was no longer on the Nightfall, nor any known ship. The walls around him pulsed, not with machinery, but with life. Bone grew from ceiling to floor in jagged lattices. Veins of glistening ichor pulsed along the structure, as if the ship itself breathed. It wasn't a vessel, it was a temple. And Sevatar, first captain of the 8th Legion, was its sacrifice. He hung in a web of restraints, not metal, but coiling ligatures of petrified sinew and rune-inscribed leather. His armor was gone, his weapons stripped, only a torn undersuit and his scarred skin remained. And yet, despite everything, his eyes retained their venom. He had been betrayed, yes. ambushed and shackled, but not broken. Never broken. He waited. Eventually, the door, or what resembled one, unfolded with a slithering hiss. 3 figures entered. The first was a Night Lord, or what was left of one. His face had been replaced by a fused iron mask shaped like a leering skull. Warp fire glimmered in his eyes. Mutated veins coiled along his neck. Once he had been Marduk Ras, an Atramentar turned warband leader after Istvan. Sevatar remembered him as clever, if untrustworthy. The second was a bloated sorcerer draped in crimson parchment and whispering to things that weren't there. His presence made the air shimmer. His shadow moved independently. The third was a creature, once human perhaps, but now it wore Night Lord's colors, but its skin was translucent, its mouth ringed with needle teeth, its voice a chime of bells and screams. Sevatar didn't flinch. Ross stepped forward. "Brother," Sevatar responded by spitting blood onto the floor between them. "You are not my brother," he rasped. The sorcerer chuckled, the sound like glass breaking in water. "We offered you freedom," he whispered. "You refused." Sevatar looked up, defiant despite cracked ribs and blood-filled lungs. "You offered me slavery." "No," Ross said smoothly. "We offered you survival, real survival. Not this crawling, stubborn clinging to past glories. You could have ruled." "I did rule," Sevatar hissed, "without demon whispers, without soul bargains. You traded our legion's legacy for hallucinations and parasites." Ross smiled, a hollow thing. "Legacy? We were always monsters, Sevatar. You just pretended otherwise." That stung more than he admitted, because Ross wasn't entirely wrong. The 8th Legion had been forged in blood, raised in darkness. Kurz had never hidden what he made them to be, but Sevatar had seen something beyond that. A structure, a design, a purpose. He had believed that even terror had a method, that discipline gave meaning to fear. These things were gone now, burned away by corruption masquerading as power. The interrogation began soon after. They didn't want secrets. They wanted confession. Night after night, the sorcerer poured warp echoes into Sevatar's skull, trying to unlock memories. They tried to show him Nostromo burning, over and over, its destruction as a justification for their heresy. They summoned visions of Kurza smiling in darkness, whispering that Sevatar had failed him. They replayed his failures, the loss of the Chiroptera, the disunity, the broken war bands. Each time Sevatar endured. He didn't deny his flaws, he simply refused to surrender them. He began speaking to the walls, not in madness but in defiance. He recited the Nostraman penal codes aloud. He listed every ship in the Legion by tonnage and name. He told stories, dryly, coldly, about past campaigns. At first, the jailers thought he was unraveling. Then they realized he was maintaining control. Every recitation, every memory was an anchor. And then, one night, something changed. The cell grew cold, not warp cold, real cold. The bone walls stiffened, the breathing stopped, and Sevatar heard a voice, not from outside, from inside. "I see you." It wasn't Ross or the sorcerer. It was familiar, wretchedly familiar. It was Kurz. "Still alive, then?" Sevatar muttered. Disappointed. The voice came again, softer. "Why do you resist them?" "Because I am not like you," Sevatar answered. Silence. Then, "You're exactly like me." That broke him more than torture ever could, because he'd spent his entire life defining himself as the foil to his father, the one who applied reason to madness. The blade that pointed forward, not inward, but Kurz saw through it all. And still, Sevatar whispered, "No." That single word became his prayer. Number he repeated it each day. No to madness, no to gods, no to surrender. And then a chance. The charnel blades, the very warband that had betrayed him, suffered a catastrophic warp breach. Some summoned thing had broken its bonds during a ritual gone awry. The ship buckled, fire spread. In the confusion, one of Sevatar's jailers, a half-warped mortal acolyte, was ordered to flee with the prisoner to use him as a bargaining chip. The acolyte underestimated him. He was dead before they reached the hangar. Sevatar limped through flame-lit corridors, scavenged a blade, and began cutting. He didn't escape with triumph. He escaped in blood. By the time he reached the nearest functioning ship, a stolen Night Lord's escort corvette, he was alone, drenched in ash, his lungs seared from smoke. But he was free, wounded, haunted, but free. He didn't return to the Nightfall. He didn't call for aid. He vanished into the void. Some say he made contact with scattered loyalist remnants. Others whisper he hunted the sorcerers who betrayed him. Some even say he met Kersey one last time, face to face, in the ruins of a forgotten moon. But no records confirm this. What is known is this: Jago Sevatarion, first captain of the Night Lords, disappeared. Not with a scream, not with a curse, but with silence. And in that silence his legend grew. Not as a hero, not as a savior, but as a reminder that even among traitors, even among monsters, there was one who did not kneel. There are no parades for exiles, no banners flown for the lost. In the black between stars, forgotten warriors are not mourned, they are feared. And when Jago Sevatarion returned, it was not to reclaim a throne, but to deliver judgment. Quiet, brutal, and absolute, his reappearance was not announced. No astropath screamed warnings, no fleet sounded alarms. He simply was, like a storm appearing beyond the horizon, unforeseen, inevitable. The first to feel his hand were the warbands of the corrupted 8th Legion who had taken refuge near the Ghoul Stars. These splintered remnants of the Night Lords had fully fallen to chaos, becoming grotesque reflections of what the Legion once was. Some had allied with demons, others had merged their flesh with warpcraft. They wore mockeries of Nostraman iconography and styled themselves demigods, prophets, or high priests. They had forgotten fear, Sevatar reminded them. The Void Shriekers were the first. Once a disciplined shock assault company, they had become a carnival of blood, raiders who burned settlements not for conquest, but for pageantry. Their flagship, Lords of the Dusk, was a shrine to excess. Hundreds of enslaved psychers moaned in rhythmic chorus to empower their warped master, Captain Viral, whose face had long since been replaced by a mask of ever-shifting eyes. They never saw Sevatar's approach. He boarded alone, no fleet, no signal, no demands. In less than an hour, the ship fell silent. An astropathic fragment recovered years later spoke of a single figure moving through the hull like a ghost. Every corridor he entered grew cold. Every defense failed. Viral's body was found impaled against the central power core, chain-glaive lodged in his chest. No one else aboard survived. Sevatar left no message. The act was the message. From there, he moved system to system. The Ebon Choir, the Hollow Dagger, the Thirsting Teeth. One by one, they vanished. Warbands that had broken the Night Lord's original creed, those who had offered their souls to chaos, were extinguished. Not in open war, but with surgical annihilation. Sevatar had become a predator of predators. He wore no heraldry. He accepted no title. He operated with no allies, no reinforcements. But rumors spread. Some claimed he was undead, returned from the grave with Kurz's curse. Others whispered that he had been changed by his imprisonment, that some demon now wore his skin. But a few, Those who still remembered the old ways spoke truth. They said Sevatar had simply had enough, not of enemies, of his own kind. To the Imperium, he was just another traitor. To Chaos, he was a threat. To the Night Lords, he was the last real Night Lord. And it wasn't just vengeance he sought, it was clarity. As the years passed and the heresy collapsed into the Scouring, Sevatar continued to hunt. He avoided the siege of Terra, not out of fear, but because he believed the battle had already been lost, the moment the Night Lords became fractured. Terra was a theater, not a crucible, and he had no time for theatrics. He hunted in forgotten regions, dead sectors, war-torn debris fields, places where no reinforcements would ever come. He wore scavenged armor, reforged his chainglaive 3 times. At one point, he carried the helm of a word-bearer sorcerer on his belt, not as a trophy, but as a warning. And still, he did not speak. There were reports, of course. A warband attempting to breach a black ship in the Kolar Drift was found torn apart. Data logs showed a lone figure boarding both sides of the engagement before eliminating everyone involved, traitor and Imperial alike. His presence was a whisper, his kills undeniable. Eventually, other traitor legions began to take note. The word-bearers offered to parley. They sent a representative to the ruins of Kanor Bahal to speak in the name of Lorgar. Only his bones were recovered. The Alpha Legion tried to trap him, laying false signals and seeding false intelligence in a broken data node on the edge of the Indrak Nebula. Their ship was never seen again. Even the Iron Warriors, typically disdainful of internal conflicts, declared Sevatar a destabilizing influence. The Night Lords, meanwhile, fell deeper into entropy. With Kurz presumed dead after his assassination on Tsagwalsa and Sevatar refusing to unify the Legion, Warband fought Warband. Brothers betrayed brothers. Fear without structure had become self-cannibalizing. And Sevatar? He stood at its edge, neither judging nor correcting. He just acted. He had become a constant, a force more than a man, the eye of a storm that never moved. But as the Scouring gave way to the Long War, Sevatar began to change, not in body, in asterisk purpose. One by one, he began to find and shelter the remnant. Those few Night Lords captains who had not fallen to chaos, who still clung to the ancient tactics, to the philosophy of fear as control, not devotion. He didn't form a new legion. He didn't crown himself, but he gathered them. A small fleet, 6 ships no more, roamed the edges of the Eye of Terror, attacking traitor-aligned pirates, corrupt Astartes, even rogue demon hosts, never openly, always with precision. Sevatar led them in silence. Every kill was methodical, every victory precise. There were whispers that he'd begun to keep a ledger again, like during the Thramas Crusade. A detailed list of warbands still loyal to the idea of the 8th Legion, not the madness it had become. Some say he even reached out to the Imperium, not for pardon but for intelligence, to know where the rot had spread deepest. Others claim that a single Inquisitor during the early centuries of M41 made direct contact with him in the hopes of leveraging his surgical brutality against demonic cults. That Inquisitor vanished, but cults in the region were eradicated with unnerving efficiency. By now, Sevatar was a shadow, no longer a name spoken with fear, a name spoken with dread. Because his legend had surpassed mortality, he was the Night Haunter's wrath unbound, the blade sharpened by betrayal. And still he did not kneel. He had been offered everything: glory, power, apotheosis. He chose solitude. He had every reason to vanish. He chose purpose. And then, nothing. Sometime during the turn of the 42nd millennium, all reports ceased. No new kills. No more sightings. The remnant dispersed. Some said he had finally died, alone, surrounded, refusing to flee. Others believed he had gone deeper, beyond known space, to hunt threats the galaxy had not yet named. But there are still those, veterans, psychers, even enemy commanders, who speak of a cold sensation before death, of a shadow seen in the reflection of void glass, of a voice like razors saying, "No gods, no masters, only justice." They say Sevatar still walks, not to save the Night Lords, not to redeem them, but to remind the galaxy that among all traitors, there was one who stood in the abyss and never blinked. History, in the grim darkness of the far future, is not written in ink or remembered through peace. It is burned into the fabric of the galaxy with fire, screamed through void hymns, and whispered in the blood-slick halls of memory. The name Sevatarion, once merely a Nostroman war orphan, later first captain of the 8th Legion, remains one of those whispers. Even after his disappearance, Jago Sevatarion's shadow lingered. In a galaxy of liars, monsters, and living gods, it was Sevatar who stood as a contradiction, a traitor who hated treachery, a killer who scorned madness, a creature born of terror who refused to be ruled by it. But legends are not preserved by mere deeds. They are kept alive by those who remember. And though most of the Night Lords fell into chaos, damnation, or obscurity, a few still carried Sevatar's name like a blade. On the fringe of Imperial space, a dead sector known as the Elysian Gulf bore witness to one such remembrance. A splinter of Night Lords calling themselves the Oathbound emerged from the warp aboard an ancient strike cruiser, the Axiom Veil. Unlike the demon ships of their cursed kin, the Axiom Veil bore no warped iconography. Its hull was scorched clean. Its banners were plain cobalt, trimmed in bone. Their warlord wore no sigils, no demonic armor. Just plain Terminator plate, marked only by a single hand-carved word etched across the chest: Sevatarion. The Oathbound did not raid, they did not summon demons. They struck only traitors, word-bearer cults, renegade Black Legion enclaves, Crimson Slaughter warbands who preyed upon isolated civilians. They hunted their own kind. Their actions confused the Imperium. Several inquisitors, seeing no overt signs of chaos, speculated that the Oathbound were a faction of misunderstood loyalists. Others called them a psyops ploy, Night Lords posing as penitent to confuse Imperial response networks. The truth was stranger. The Oathbound were not loyalists. They were not traitors. They were Sevatar's legacy. Fragments of warbands once contacted by the first captain, captains and sergeants he had spared, instructed, warned, or spared for later use. Many had never met him in person, but the message had spread like wildfire among the disillusioned. Fear as a weapon, not a god. Precision as creed, justice over survival. To these warriors, Sevatar was no longer just a former commander. He was the last truth of their legion, and their creed was simple. They would fight as he had fought, even if it killed them, especially if it killed them. Meanwhile, among the ranks of the Imperium, something stranger still occurred. In isolated archives, inquisitorial databanks, and even within the halls of the Ordo Hereticus, references to a ghost legion began to surface. Combat footage of blue-armored Astartes, slaughtering demonic cults, leaving no survivors, vanishing into the night. One such report, sealed under Omega Cipher, detailed an incident on Caltha Morn, where a word-bearer insurgency had established a summoning gate. A single Night Lord's vessel entered orbit and deployed boarding torpedoes. An hour later, the surface was silent, the gate destroyed, the insurgents dead. Their final moments were captured by a servo skull, a blur of blue and black, a glaive flashing through blood and fire, and a voice, calm, cold, saying, "You have abandoned fear. I will return it to you." The footage was traced back to a single signature embedded in the encryption, Claw 1. The first Claw, Sevatar's old warband. But Sevatar was gone, wasn't he? In the Eye of Terror, rumors told another tale, on the demon world Abyssia. A word-bearer prophet named Exarch Gulavrin once spoke of a warrior who came in his dreams. Not a demon, not a god. A man in blue armor who severed Gulavrin's limbs and demanded the names of corrupted night lords. "Jago," Gulavrin whispered in his final breath, "the Pale King comes." Among the Night Lords still loyal to chaos, Sevatar's name became an anathema. Warbands whispered of the First Claw returned, a mythic executioner who hunted warp cults and slaughtered demon hosts with surgical precision. Some began to purge their own ranks at the fear that Sevatar might come for them. It was the ultimate irony. Even in absence, Sevatar wielded terror as a weapon, just as he always had. But it wasn't just fear he left behind. In a distant moon vault on Vorlar 9, a Mechanicus exploratory team recovered an ancient data casket encrypted in Nostraman code, long since believed extinct. Inside were tactical treatises, reflections, and recorded oaths, Sevatar's personal doctrine. It spoke not of victory, not of conquest, but of discipline. One entry read, "We do not serve gods. We do not bleed for prophecy. We were made to terrify, but terror is nothing without precision. Fear without control is chaos. Chaos is failure." The casket was seized by the Inquisition and remains classified to this day. Yet fragments of its content have leaked into clandestine Imperial Tactica. There are kill team squads who now train using Sevatar's Spiral, a close combat maneuver adapted from his known dueling techniques. There are cadets in Schola Progenium facilities who speak of the Ghost of Nostromo as a cautionary tale, warning them that even among enemies, honor can survive, and that betrayal is not always a matter of allegiance, but of compromise. Kurz had called Sevatar his executioner, but Sevatar by the end was something more. He was the conscience of a legion that had no right to have one. And perhaps that is why he was feared most of all, because he proved that even in a world of monsters, choice remained. He chose to refuse the gods. He chose to hold to structure. He chose to lead without worship. And when his brothers abandoned purpose for power, he chose to hunt them, not out of vengeance, out of duty. Jago Sevatarion's body was never recovered. His death was never confirmed, but his legacy remains, not in the shrines of traitors, not in the scrolls of saints, but in the dark places where warriors stand alone, blade in hand, refusing to bow to madness. And in those moments, those lonely, desperate, defiant moments, the shadow of the First Claw still lingers, watching, waiting, unforgiven, but never untrue.